Hey, what's up, guys? We are live. So we got a new guest joining us, Trent Horn. Trent, what's interesting is that I honestly was not familiar with who you are outside of what like random people told me. But when I announced this debate, I actually had a bunch of people message me and saying, "Oh, dude, you debating Trent? He's good, man. What are you going to debate him about?" So you actually have a fairly, I guess, a lot of people in my community know who you are, which you wouldn't expect because we're in totally different communities. But I think like a good start for anyone who's not familiar with you, can you give like a little quick intro about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so my name's Trent Horn. I am the host of the Council of Trent podcast and YouTube channel. So I produce two videos a week, three audio podcast episodes. I'm also a Catholic writer and speaker, so I've written about a dozen books, and I teach people how to explain and defend the Catholic faith. I do that. I work at a group called Catholic Answers. They have the website Catholic.com, something that the Pope probably wishes he had. And so I just show people that being Catholic is awesome. It's true, good, and beautiful. And I explain that to people. I dialogue, I debate about it. And yeah, so I'm just excited to come here and talk about what you wanted to talk about tonight.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, I only watched in preparation for this. I kind of skimmed through your channel, and the one that's the debate that struck out to me, just because I was actually there, was the modern day debate when Andrew made Andrew or Matt Dillahunty quit. And I like your analysis of that. I actually found myself agreeing with actually every single thing you said in terms of that analysis. Uh, you sort of kind of because I wasn't there like in person, but I was there at the event, and then I watched it on YouTube like everyone else who was in the group chat. I was like,
Yeah.
damn, like why the fuck did Andrew go there? But the way you explain it, which is that well, he opened the door, and so he was kind of responding, even though he did use a lot of hyperbole. I thought it was a good explanation. So yeah, man. So anyway, for anyone who's not familiar, the topic for this debate is going to be primarily centered around premarital sex. Is it good or bad? We agreed offline that we're going to keep this kind of informal, so we're not going to do like it's not going to be a super formal debate. It's going to be more of a discussion type of discussion type based debate. And then also we agreed that it's going to be kind of open for other topics. Like if we're talking about something and something else is something we're both interested in discussing, that we could potentially veer in that direction if we already finished discussing the main topic. Yeah, it's going to be fairly informal. And also, I was thinking, Trent, if you're okay with that, that it would probably be easiest when we're talking about is premarital sex like a good idea or bad idea if we focus on for men because this audience is 99% men. If you're okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can focus on that, but I mean, it's also good to talk about what this does to women
Sure.
because as men, we have relationships with women. I think the majority of your audience, if they're seeking marriage, they're seeking to marry a woman, and so it's all kind of interrelated. But yeah, whatever. Let's see what happens.
Cool. Yeah, we can kind of maybe cover men first, and then we can, if it leads into it, or later on, we can circle back and discuss like premarital sex for women.
Yeah.
Um, how familiar are you with me before? Because I you gave an introduction. Are you familiar with me at all?
Yes, I also perused some of your videos and got a feel for that. I saw some of your previous debates that you've engaged in on this subject and others. So I think I have a good handle on your perspective on the matter. And I mean, I understand why you would take the view that premarital sex is good, or at least it's not bad. Uh, you essentially promote a business of helping men to engage in sex primarily outside of marriage.
Yeah. While what you're saying is true, I feel like it kind of creates a distorted narrative, which is that I have some kind of money motivation here. I've always been pro premarital sex. I was having a lot of premarital sex before I even started a YouTube channel. That would almost be like me arguing that, well,
Yeah.
yeah, but you have a business or you have an organization that defends, Catholic values. So therefore, you have a vested interest in, So it just kind of I feel like while the
Okay.
facts are accurate, it it muddles the waters for what our motivations are for discussing this topic.
Sure, that's fine. But I think it's important that people know who we are, where we're coming from. But I don't mean any slight by that or trying to make an ad hominem or anything like that. I was just saying, and going through and researching what you do, I discovered, oh, it's your this is your occupation. Oh yeah, well, I guess that all kind of comes together. But of course, there are many people who don't see problems with premarital sex, and there's also a lot of people who do see problems. So yeah. let's
Yeah,
chat.
but kind of like by that logic, like, it makes sense that you're Catholic based on what you do, right? Because if you, unless you're like a massive hypocrite, you would not be doing what you do if you weren't Catholic, right? It's kind of the same
Right.
thing here. It's like, unless I was a massive fucking hypocrite, right? I wouldn't
Yeah.
be doing what I do if I believed premarital sex was bad, because I would not feel comfortable doing something what I feel like is causing massive harm to society, right? So I feel like that, just to clarify that, I feel like that's a
Sure.
pretty standard thing when it comes to this type of stuff. But yeah, do you want to go? Do you want to give your opening statement first? Do you want me to go first? I'll
Yeah,
leave it
I
up
mean,
to you.
I didn't really have an opening statement planned, but I mean, the general thing that I would look at as to why I would say premarital sex is bad is just that it is wrong to misuse sex. I think we can agree that sex is a very powerful thing. It's a very important thing, and it should be used properly. And so to understand how to use sex properly, we need to ask the question, what is sex for? We have to know what is it for in order to know whether it's being used or it's being misused. And I think a lot of problems we have in society come from people misusing sex. So I would say that what sex is for expressing marital love. So sex creates, it's primarily for bonding and babies. That's what sex is for. It doesn't mean that you can only have sex if you're planning to have a baby or something like that. What sex is for is that it is the expression of a unique kind of love. Now, all love seeks union with the beloved. So I love In-N-Out cheeseburgers. Because I love the In-N-Out cheeseburger, I seek union with it, and I and the cheeseburger become one. It goes in my stomach.
I'm
If you
assuming
love
you're
a
not having sex with the cheeseburger, though, right? Hopefully.
Right, but that's what's important. There's different kinds of love. That's why I want to tease this out. So sex is an expression of love, but not all expressions of love involve sex. In fact, the vast majority, like 99% of the love we express, does not involve sex. It doesn't, right? But we still love all kinds of people and things. When you love a thing, you love a hobby, you love a person, you want to be united to it. So if you love a friend, you want to seek union on the emotional and the mental level. You spend time with them. So when you love someone in marriage, what makes it different from any other kind of love is that you seek not just an emotional union, not just a union of activities and minds and time. You seek bodily union. And so sex is for that kind of bodily union. It's the full and complete gift of self to another person. I give everything that's mine to you, my emotions, my body, my very fertility, and you give that. And marital love is giving that till death do us part, to make this permanent monogamous bond with another person. So that's what sex is for. That's why when people commit infidelity, when you're in a marriage and someone has sex with somebody else, it's so awful. It can lead to the divorce of a marriage because you're expressing that very special kind of love for other people. So sex is very, very important and special and sacred in that regard. When it's misused, you get a lot of problems that result from that. So that you take premarital sex, for example, sex has a bonding element to it. Like when you have sex with someone, it releases the hormone oxytocin. It bonds you to that other person, which is great in marriage because you've already discerned you want to be bonded with this person for life. But when you have sex outside of marriage, you can end up bonded with somebody. Maybe you haven't entirely thought this thing through, right? Uh, Other issues that would come up is that I would say it's wrong. It is wrong to create children outside of marriage because children have a right to their mother and their father. Parents are irreplaceable to their children. Now, you can try to have substitutes. You can do best you can if parents die. But really, we need something to make parents irreplaceable to each other, or who are irreplaceable to a child, make them irreplaceable to each other. And that's why basically every society on earth came up with marriage and reserved sex for marriage. But if you go out and you engage in premarital sex, there is a decent chance, even if you try to use contraception, do other things like that, you will create a child whose rights were violated because they should come into existence in a marriage. And there's a good likelihood that child could get aborted. That child could end up being raised in a broken home, single parent home, this bad stuff. And so I would say that you just should not engage in sexual activity with someone unless you have made the proper steps to say, I am perfectly fine with you becoming pregnant. And the only context where that'd be okay would be marriage. So I would say that even if there were some kind of benefits to premarital sex, I don't see really very many, if any. it would be easily outweighed by all the harms that come with society. Premarital sex has been statistically linked to higher divorce rates for people. The people with the lowest divorce rates are the people who do not have premarital sex. So yeah, overall, I don't think it's good for you. I think people should reserve sex to be an expression of marital love, and I think that's the best way to live.
Okay, I wrote down everything you said, so I want to go through point by point. The one
Sure.
thing that you and I sort of agree on is that I do think if you want to have children, it is more optimal to do it after marriage or with someone you're married to, and that's just purely going based off of consequences worldview. It seems that children do better when both parents are in the picture, and typically that's more likely to happen if they're married. So on that one, we don't have any substantive disagreement. I just think it's a more optimal way of raising your children, right? And if you're trying to do what's best for society as a whole, then that would be a reasonable prescription. Now, you mentioned infidelity. The reason infidelity causes marital issues is because you're breaking the person's trust. You're lying and cheating on them. For example, if you're in an open relationship or an open marriage, which is not something that I would recommend, well, let's say you're on that, you having sex with a different person won't cause that issue, right? So it's not just the act of someone having sex with someone else. It's primarily the breaking in trust and the breaking in, just that person's, I guess, regard for them. It's like, hey, this person fucked me over, type of thing. Like, for example, let's say you're my roommate and we have an agreement that, like, if you're ever short on money, you can just grab money from my wallet and it's all good. And then you'll pay me back at some point, right? And that was to happen, there would be no issue. But let's say we did not have that understanding, right? And you took shit out of my wallet, we'd have a big issue, right? It wasn't the actual fact that you took the money. Maybe it's insignificant. Maybe it's like $20. It's just the fact that you violated my trust. So I think that's an important distinction to have there. I also just fundamentally reject the premise that having premarital sex is in any way misusing sex. To someone who's agnostic like me and a lot of people watching, I would need to hear some solid reasons, like pragmatic, utilitarian, outcomes-based reasons for why it is something that's in any way either misusing sex or it's in any way negative. I can tell you a whole bunch of outcomes-based reasons for why having premarital sex is a good thing. But I guess I would need to hear some that are equally as convincing, if not more convincing, than ones I'm going to give for the other side. And also, just to lastly say that either you like to get someone pregnant if you take precautions, I think is a bit either ignorant or silly. If you were to wear condoms and use them properly, and also if you're really, really paranoid, the girl's on birth control, the chances of you getting her pregnant is like close to zero. It's like 0-0. You have a better chance of getting hit by a car when you're driving, getting hit by a drunk driver at some point, right? So, of course, with any activity, there's going to be some level of risk. I think we as humans, and just sane humans, would generally look, okay, is the risk significant, or is it really, really minor? Like, I'm assuming that you're not afraid to go outside because there's a small chance a drunk driver is going to like fucking veer off and hit you. And then if there was someone, if I was like arguing like, hey, Trent, you shouldn't leave the house because there's a high chance that a drunk driver will hit you, you'd be like, dude, that's a little silly. Like, like as long as I don't walk in the middle of the street, I think I'm fine. It's the same thing here, right? The equivalent of walking in the middle of the street would be having unprotected sex with girls you don't know, right? But if you're wearing condom and also it's a girl you know and she's on birth control, and there are forms of birth control that are not detrimental to women's health, by the way, it's just also another side note, then the risk is insignificant. It's just it's not there. So that would be, I guess, what I would say. So I guess I don't know where you want to start off, but those are kind of the big points in regards to what you said.
Mm-hmm. All righty. Well, there's a lot to go through here, so let's go through a few of that. Let's start with the last one, talking about children. I don't think that the analogy is on par. I see what you're saying, that you wouldn't say, oh, don't engage in this activity because there is a risk of something bad happening. You're correct. There's a risk of something bad happening in any kind of activity. But I think when it comes to sex, it's a little bit different. Like, there is a risk when I drive in my car, I will be killed in a car accident. But my life would be severely, severely hindered if I never got into an automobile. I couldn't go to work. I couldn't go to the gym. I couldn't run errands. So the benefits massively, massively outweigh the risks that are involved. And I would say the risk of me being in a car accident are much less than 1%. But if you look at the Centers for Disease Control, for example, the failure rates of contraceptives are anywhere between 2 and 23%. The idea that it's nearly zero, even when you use perfect use, that's implying that you always store condoms correctly, put them on correctly, always use them. The birth control pill is always used. The girl doesn't skip a day, that the pills aren't defective. I would say Well, let's just say that the risk there of creating a child is, I'll set it low. Let's set it at, let's just set it at 0.5%, 0.5%. Okay. So 99.5% chance won't get pregnant, 0.5% of a chance. I would say that the better activity to compare it to might be this. Let's say that people get together and they say, hey, we really like to play a game where it's super exciting. It really like turns us on. We put on bulletproof vests and shoot each other. And we've got these really great bulletproof vests. They only fail 0.5% of the time. So 1 out of 200 times somebody gets shot and they die. I would say, I guess it's something you get a lot of enjoyment out of, but it still seems like a dumb thing for me to do, that you should only fire a gun if you're okay killing the thing that you are aiming it at. And the joy from that activity doesn't justify even that small risk for such a serious consequence that's involved, taking a life. Much the same way, you shouldn't fire your member into someone unless you're completely okay with them getting pregnant. So I think that would be a bit more analogous when it comes to the risk reward element. That's just the serious consequence when this happens with children. I would say that the pleasures of sex don't justify the risk that they're putting. And the thing is, when you look in society, it's just painfully obvious. 30% of kids live without both their mother and father. Premarital sex is often a cause of that. I mean, it's not an unheard of thing,
Yeah, so I think we have to use statistics correctly. So, okay, so when you say up to 23%, that implies if you're using condoms incorrectly. Condoms, if used correctly, have about a 2% failure rate. And then if you combine that with an IUD, which is not something you have to take, it's something that's literally injected in you, lasts like 3 to 5 years, depending on which one you use, that has less than 1% failure rate. So if you want to be extra cautious and you combine condoms with an IUD, you get I guess, a risk factor of, I don't know, 0.02%, right? It's less than a fraction of a fraction of a percent. So if you take the proper precautions, the risk is insanely small. It's not half a percentage. It's not even a fraction of a percent. It's a fraction of a fraction of a percent. So I think
what percent of people do you think use contraceptives perfectly?
Probably not the majority of people, but again, just because people don't do something well doesn't mean that it's ineffective. That's like, okay, well, how many people do you think wear seatbelts? Well, not a lot, but if you do wear a seatbelt because you're worried about safety, seatbelts generally work. So we can't look at like, well, a lot of people are dumb and don't know how to do shit, so therefore that thing in of itself doesn't work. We have to evaluate the thing based on its merit and not the average dumb fuck who's trying to do that thing.
Right, but that's comparing a device that alleviates harm in a certain situation that does not cause you or motivate you to engage in this thing that could cause the harm in the first place. So the point in me asking, and I think you and I would agree, the majority of people do not use contraceptives perfectly. That's important because when places like the Centers for Disease Control talk about the failure rates of contraceptives, they compare the perfect use method, perfect use like 0.02%, 1%, 2%, and the actual use, which can be as high as 23%. So there, I think the risk becomes more. You're correct. There are some contraceptives that can make it very unlikely for women to become pregnant, like IUDs or intrauterine devices. But many of these kinds of contraceptives, you said there are ones that don't cause health harms to women. I would say the IUD certainly does. It causes a perpetual infection within the uterus to prevent the woman from becoming pregnant. So once again, then she has to undertake this kind of a risk. And I would say if you care about a woman in a relationship, I don't know why you would have them undertake that risk, use birth control, which is a class 1 carcinogen. I just am not in favor of that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go one at a time. So there are definitely health issues when it comes to like birth control pills, right? That some women experience. I don't even think it's the majority of women, but it's a significant percentage of women. But that's why they've developed much better form of birth control, right? So I think the one that, not to put my personal business out there too much, but I think the one that my girlfriend uses because she's super big into health is the one that's like like they put it inside your vagina, I guess, and it like works more mechanically to prevent, I don't know, a baby. Again, I don't know the exact science of it, but I know she's super big into health. And that one specifically, she like raves about. Also, there are advantages also to some women for using birth control. I've heard this time and time again. I know some women who are actually not having sex who take birth control. It clears up their acne. It, makes their periods a lot better. It modulates their hormone cycles. So birth control can be good or bad, and also a lot of it is based on which one is being used for which woman. But again, that's a little bit of an aside. I guess my question to you would be, what percentage of risk would you be comfortable with when it came to premarital sex? Like, it would be 0.00001%. Like, what would be, I think, at what point would you say, okay, the risk is negligible?
Well, I don't use a risk reward element to that when it comes to sex because I'm making a moral argument. I'm saying just what sex is for, and I'm asking what do children have a right to? Like, what kind of things am I going to do to place a child at risk of something? So there is a pragmatic argument that one can make. Oh, well, if it's, point 100 zeros and a one, it's never going to happen. Then I would say that that's something that's a negligible risk. It's something you don't have to be concerned about. But the probability of creating a child through sex, even if you use contraceptives, is not negligible. It happens every day to people. About 13% of people who go to Planned Parenthood seeking an abortion were regularly and consistently using contraceptives. So I would say that it's certainly not negligible given the real world data. But I would say that I'm making more of a moral argument that a child has a right to his mother and his father. So I would hope you would agree with that a child has a right to be raised by his mother and father in a married, stable home, and to do something that could jeopardize that right that they have by creating them outside of that context. Uh, I would say that it's always wrong to do that, regardless of the risk, and the risk never approaches an infinitesimal point. It's always a decent or understandable risk, and it's just something you shouldn't do to a child. And many children have been harmed in coming into existence in these unstable kinds of unions. It's not fair to them.
I would argue that it's more optimal to have children while you're married, but I don't think a child has some kind of an alienable right. The child that's not even born yet or is not even an embryo yet. Do you think it's immoral for a married couple over 30 to have sex?
No.
Because if we're following this logic, we all know that when people have sex later on in life, like 30s, the chance for birth defects and all kinds of, chronic health issues significantly increases, right? So by that logic, then it would also be, if we're looking at pragmatic, then it would also be wrong for people over the age of 30 or 35 to have sex, because that child, if it comes out, is significantly more likely to be sickly, right? Or to have all kinds of health issues, all kinds of mental issues. So
Well, let me address that argument. One, that would more apply to women having sex over the age of 35, but even there, it's not an astronomical risk. Number two, you haven't violated the child's rights because, and this gets into a philosophical issue called the problem of non-identity. That can you harm someone who does not exist yet? And the answer is you can harm them depending on whether they would have existed otherwise. So, for example, I think you would agree that if you have a pregnancy and you have a fetus, if you drink a bunch of alcohol and the child has fetal alcohol syndrome, then that child has been harmed. Even if you don't think the fetus is a person yet, you shouldn't drink while you're pregnant, or even just taking even a born child and you do something and they become disabled, you've hurt and you've harmed a person who exists and that same person could have existed without the disability. That's the issue, whether they're a fetus or a born infant. If you do something to them, it's wrong because that same person could have existed without the disability. The problem, though, is that let's say you have sex at the age of 35 and a child comes into existence who has Down syndrome. I would say you have not harmed that child because your only alternative action would be to not have sex. But in this case, you would not have the same child without Down syndrome. That particular child would not have existed at all. So it's either a choice between non-existence or existence with some kind of disability. But they haven't been harmed in that respect.
But by that
Uh,
logic, if the parents were more responsible, they would just have the child earlier on in life instead of focusing on their career.
No, but it would have been if you have sex earlier, it would not have been the same child. That's why brothers and sisters are not identical. If it's different sperm and it's different egg. Now, actually, if I steel man this, I'll jump back over to your side.
Sure.
One could one could make a similar argument if people had premarital sex that a child will come into existence, that same child. But I would say that the harm that is caused to them is something that is within the control of the parents who generate the child. It is within their power to be able to be married and to provide for a child that comes from their union a marital relationship. And they could provide that before they have sex with this and cause this particular individual to come into existence. So I would say it's not comparable to the Down syndrome case where the parents have less control over that child coming into existence free from that kind of disability.
Yeah, so I'm mainly interested in talking about like outcomes based. I generally find myself to be mostly pragmatic.
Sure.
The thing is that we can talk about morals, but you and I probably have largely different morals. I'm sure we have some overlap. We both don't like murder. We both don't like rape. We both don't like theft, right? So there's going to be a good amount of overlap. But on this, when it comes to this, we're just going to have a irreconcilable moral difference, right?
Well,
So, but I think
no,
what
I don't think that's the case because you use moral principles also. We can move to the second thing you mentioned about infidelity. Then, excuse me, uh, because would you say that cheating in a relationship, you're in a well, yeah, cheating, adultery. It's not really adultery. It's not adultery if you're not married, but it's cheating. Infidelity. Would you say infidelity is morally wrong?
So yeah, I will answer that question just to clarify. When I said that, I wasn't trying to make a moral argument. I was just pointing out what I saw a flaw as part of your opening statement when you were
Mhm.
talking about one of the downsides of having, you're making the point about, sex outside wedlock and how it
Mhm.
causes all this harm. So I was
Yeah.
just pointing out that that harm isn't caused by the actual sex; it's caused by the breaking of trust. I wasn't making a moral argument, but I will answer your question. Yes, I do think it's
Mhm.
unethical to cheat. But that's neither here or there to the actual argument that I was saying. I was just pointing out how, again, if we're looking at harm, obviously we can both agree there's practical, tangible harm that happens when two people who are in a monogamous marriage and one of them steps out and cheats on the other person, right? There's no disagreement there. But that same harm
Mhm.
doesn't exist if those two people have an open marriage, right? Because so it's not the actual sex that caused that harm, or at least most of that harm. It was caused by the break in trust, right? And because no one likes to feel like they've been lied to or they've been deceived. So that's just kind of, I think, an important distinction. I kind of want to mention that to just kind of dismiss that side of the argument
Okay.
that you're trying to
Well,
make.
let me go into infidelity because I'm trying to understand your position. I don't think because my view is that, and when I finish this, I would like to hear your answer to the question, "What is sex for?" That my view is that sex is an extremely important thing. It's the expression of marital love. So it's an expression of an extremely important kind of love that bonds spouses together. And because sex is this very important and valuable thing, when you break trust related to sex, it's much more serious than other times of breaking trust. So if you say, well, the reason infidelity is wrong is just because you've broken trust, but in a marriage, you can break someone's trust in all kinds of ways. Like my wife Laura might say to me, "Hey, are you going to go and pick up the milk from the store afterwards?" I say, "Oh yeah, I'll do that." And if maybe I'm careless and I forget, or I knew I was supposed to get the milk, but I chose and said, I really need to do this other errand first. I think it's more important, so I do something else. Or I could, or Laura might tell me, "Hey, don't tell your friend I said this." And then I accidentally blurt it out. I blurt it out him, or I tell him because I want to share gossip. I've broken trust with her. But I think you would agree that breaking trust by sharing gossip about my wife with a friend is far less minor than breaking trust with my wife by having sex with one of my friends. Correct?
Yeah, I think most wives would be much more forgiving of that. But
But why
sure,
is that the case?
well, because it's a level of deception. So there's different gravity to different lies, right? So that's why we have the term white lie. The whole point of a white lie is like a harmless lie. So, for example, let's say that I don't know, Like we're supposed to start 8:30. I come in at 8:45 and you're like, hey, Alex, why are you late? And I'm like, I was stuck in traffic, but really I just had bad diarrhea and I was stuck in the toilet. I'm kind of embarrassed to
Mhm.
tell you. I don't think like most people will be like, oh my God, that was so fucked up. But let's say the reason that I was late is because I was like fucking robbing a store or something like that. Or just let's like even take something illegal outside. Let's just say that the reason was because I was too busy jacking off to internet porn. Then people
Mhm.
would look at me much more funny. So I think that there's different levels to lies and there's different levels to breaking trust. Like again, yeah, like if my girlfriend, for example, tells me a little white lie about something, I'm not going to break up with her. But if she significantly lies to me, then I would. It would be the same thing going the other way. So gossip by most people, like when people say, "Oh, please don't share that thing," as long as it's not something that's really important. But let's say your wife, if we just follow this analogy down the road, if
Sure.
we let's say your wife told you something that's really really significant to her, like let's say that she was trying to keep it a secret that she's suffering, God forbid, she's feeling suicidal, and that was like
Yeah.
really big to her, like she doesn't want
Yeah.
anyone to know,
Mhm.
and you were to tell the world that could potentially be the end of the relationship because that's a significant violation of trust. So even with that,
Mhm.
even with like telling things that your partner said, there's levels to it.
Mhm. Well, I think you're on the right track here to say that when you lie or betray someone, the more valuable thing that you have betrayed, the more serious it becomes. So if my wife tells me that she likes a movie that's really embarrassing, and I tell other people about that, that's not as valuable or serious of an issue. So breaking trust in that regard isn't as serious.
Hmm.
But when it comes to sex, though, it seems very different. I mean, a lot of times a man could have sex. I don't even think when you bring up the issue of deception that that's the issue because there's lots of people who commit adultery without lying about it. They just go and they're able to have sex with someone and
Trent,
their wife
it's an implicit lie because the understanding in that relationship was that we're going to be monogamous to each other. That's still a lie, right? It just
well, it's a
because.
broken promise.
Well, I would say it's also an implicit lie because again, you're the understanding, or at least you had an implicit understanding, right? And implicit understanding can be just as strong as a explicit understanding. So, for example, you and I might have we've never discussed this, like between the two of us during email, but we have an implicit understanding that we're gonna, hear the other person out. We're not gonna, or let's take something more significant that we're not gonna clip that. I'm not gonna clip this debate into like 20% of it into parts that make you look bad, or I'm not gonna like fucking mute you when you start talking, things like that. We didn't discuss it, but it's still an implicit understanding that we have because we both engage in debate. It's the same thing here. When the husband marries the wife, assuming they're in a monogamous traditional relationship, the implicit understanding is that we're only gonna have sex with each other, even if that wasn't explicitly stated.
Well, I would say that's a little bit different because in the example you gave, it's not about breaking implicit trust with me that I would assume you would not do those things. The real seriousness is the act of doing those things are deceptive, are lying, are slanderous. It is those actions themselves. Whereas when it comes to infidelity, you're trying to say the act of sex is not the bad thing, it's the breaking of the implicit trust. But here, once again, I'm going to push back. Let me give you another example. Suppose you're in a relationship with someone and they say, "Hey, look, I'm only going to date a vegetarian. I can't date anybody who eats meat." And you're like, "Okay, yeah, I'm not going to eat meat." And then they catch you cheating and you're eating meat. Uh, I think most people would see that, oh, well, that's unfortunate. I guess you guys are going to break up. But most people wouldn't say that you're just like an awful, scummy kind of person. It just turns out you guys just aren't really as compatible. You couldn't maintain that particular promise to one another. But the promise of monogamy, it seems to be beyond just what two people promise to each other as just their personal quirk of their relationship, that it's a universal norm to be expected that you don't do that in relationships, especially marriage. And that the wrongness of infidelity is not just because of the promises that two people make to each other. It's rooted more in what sex is for. So I would say it's different in that regard.
Yeah, so I would say that, and I did write down your question, what is sex for? And I do intend on answering that once we just get through this. But if
Sure.
sex was the actual issue, then you would say it would be equally as detrimental for couples who are in open marriage or swingers, right?
I
Because
agree.
then,
No, I agree that it's also wrong even if it is wrong, that is a misuse of sex, because anyone who thinks open marriages are bad or disordered or messed up, I would say only my view can explain their assessment of open marriages, because it's the misuse of sex that's wrong. It's not just only rooted in the partner's preferences.
You went back to morality. I'm talking outcomes, because that's what we were discussing earlier. Would that earlier, but would that in the case of a open marriage, or in a case of a couples who are swingers, would that cause the same negative consequences to their relationship as it would, for example, if you were to sleep with another girl?
Well, I would say one negative consequence. There's not a lot of studies on this, but from anecdotal evidence and from the few studies we have, open marriages tend to have much higher failure rates than traditionally monogamous marriages. So if we're talking about outcome, if you're saying, well, my worldview is outcome based, you have to stipulate what kind of outcome you're aiming for in order to judge your system. So, for example, if your outcome is stable, long-lasting marriages, then that's going to show many sexual behaviors are bad, like that premarital sex is more likely to divorce, open marriage is more likely to lead to that, pornography use. So I'm actually okay with you talking about outcome based, but you have to stipulate what the outcome is.
Yeah, so I'm not at all arguing in favor of open marriages. That's not my belief system or anything like that. I'm essentially giving you internal critique, where I'm diving into the things you're saying and pointing out potential contradictions. So earlier you were talking about, okay, well, yeah, but why is it so particularly bad if the guy or the girl, right, was to have sex outside of outside of wedlock, right? Like, there's got to be something to the sex. I was saying, well, no, because if a couple who's in open marriage, which I agree with you, is less overall likely to work out, if it was the sex, then you would have to, by that logic, say, well, yeah, like someone like Destiny, when he was married, if he had sex with another girl, that would be as equally as detrimental to their relationship as you having sex with another girl besides your wife, right? Which, but I think
it's equally detrimental in some respects. So it's equally detrimental in the fact that sex would be equally misused. So there's that aspect of it. You can say, I mean, if you have, for example, two people who involve, like, let's say, for example, there was this couple, two guys in Germany. One of them had a sexual fetish to be a cannibal, and another guy had a fetish that he wanted to be eaten by somebody. So they got together for dinner, and the cannibal ate the other dude. And I think he was actually found guilty of murder in that regard. Now, I would say that let's take another. So those two guys, we'll call them Hans and Franz. Hans eats Franz. And then let's have Bob and Frank. And Bob and Frank don't have this cannibal pact. Bob just chooses to eat Frank one day. Now, I think I would say that both of them are equally harmed in that by the act of cannibalism, in that Franz and Frank are dead. But there's an unequal harm in that, Bob and Frank had a pre-existing relationship and promise implicitly, you're not going to eat me. And it would be very like, oh, this is horrible. You're eating me. Why did you do this to me? So there is an equal harm in one respect, and there is a harm in another respect. So I would say that open marriages, which I consider an oxymoron, by the way, the whole point of marriage is that you just promise not to have sex with other people. That's what makes marriage different from any other relationship. So an open marriage is just an oxymoron. It's like a square circle to me. It doesn't make sense. So there's an equal harm, and then there's an unequal harm, if that makes sense.
I sort of see where you might be trying to go with this, but are you really equating premarital sex to murder and cannibalism? The issue with the cannibalism, I see the analogy you're making, and it works with cannibalism because, yes, like, we can all inherently agree that murder is evil. You're taking another person's life, even if you have some kind of implicit understanding, right? So I see how that works for that specific, like, extremely unlikely example, right? Mm-hmm. I just don't see how that all is any way equivalent to premarital sex or sex, or just sex outside of wedlock, because you're not killing someone, right? It's the real issue, again, like I said, with having sex, stepping out on your partner, right? Whether you're married or in a relationship, is that you're violating their trust. And like, I think if we're just to be intellectually honest, we would argue, and even though neither one of us is in favor of open marriages, we would agree that in a case like Destiny, if Destiny goes out and sleeps with another girl, that will cause way more harm to that. I mean, that will cause way less issues in that relationship, if any at all, than if you were to go out and have sex with another girl, right? Can we at least agree on that?
It causes harm. It causes less harm in some respects, but it still causes serious harm. That's how I would answer
But what would
that
be the,
question.
from an outcomes based perspective, what would be the serious harm if you're in open marriage and your wife is cool with it, if you having sex with another girl, assuming that you
Or
don't
her
forget?
having sex. I mean, not to make it personal, but you brought him up. Look what happened to Destiny's marriage. I know I'm not making the argument that that's, indicative of every single thing, but if an outcome based, when you have sex with other people, sex is for bonding. Like sex, it cements a relationship with someone. That's why it's good for married couples when they fight, when they have stresses, when they have difficulties in married life. Sex is a pick me up to help say, hey, I love you. We'll get through all these things. It bonds you together with that person. But when you bond with more and more and more people, it's like taking the scotch tape. The more the tape is affixed to different substances, it loses its adhesive qualities, which shows that when you look, for example, at women who have sex outside of marriage and their divorce rates, the lowest are those who do not have any premarital sex. The next highest are those who have like one partner. Then it drops down a little bit for 3 to 5, like 3 to 8 partners, and then it goes up way more when it's 9 or more partners. So you see what I'm saying there?
Yeah, sure.
The
So
harm from that.
yeah. So if we just like, I'm very well familiar with the study you're talking about. It's the Institute of Family Studies. But one interesting thing about this study that no one ever talks about, or at least like not on your side, is that you see something very interesting that happens when you go past 2 partners. Actually, the risk of divorce actually drops. So it goes 0, 1, 2, and then actually goes down like this a bit. And
Correct.
you have to get to like 8 or 9 partners
That's right.
before it picks back up. So if there was something inherent about body count, right, then you would expect to go like this, or at the very least like this. Even the authors of the study, like I've read that study pretty closely. Even the authors of the study say there's no evidence that this is causation. We think it's largely correlation because people who have zero, body count of 0, they're much more likely to be religious, and religious people tend to stay together longer. So that's not even me speculating. That's what the author of the study was saying.
Well, the problem is anybody can speculate on the relations between these things. Like, why would you have that strange dip from 3 to 5 and then it goes back up again? My theory is that there's more likely for divorce if you've only had 1 or 2 previous partners, is that a woman who's maybe only had sex with one other person and then they get married, they might get really, really fixated on that one person. It's the person who got away. It's the other person that kind of fills up in their mind. And that particular effect of clogging up their memories and what they think about gets diminished when the partners are, 3 to 5. So it drops down a bit. It's still much higher than 0. And then when you get up to 8 or more, 10, 12, 15, 20, by that point, sex has become something that it becomes almost recreational. You're losing, you've really lost a sense of the sacredness and wonder of the importance of the bonding element to sex.
Yeah, so if we just adopt your, I guess, your perspective on that, then you would expect, because when you've only had sex with one person, that's when you're like, they're the most in your head. When you've had sex with 2 people, then it's less of a strong emotion because there's 2 people in the picture, not 3. But then what we see here is that it actually goes up from 1 to 2, the risk of divorce, and it only goes down after 3, and then after 4, and then after 4, and then picks up. But anyway, I can't prove that your speculation about that isn't true. There might be some element of that, but I think really the big picture is, I think the elephant in the room, and I know we're kind of getting off track, but I do think it's an important person to address, is like, you agree that religious people get divorced less, right? Like, I think we can agree on that.
Yeah, it depends on the kind of religious person, but the question of who does and
On
doesn't get
average.
divorced, there are studies that try to correct for what might be a correlation versus a causation. So it can be difficult to pinpoint, but it does seem that there are particular things that you can do to lessen the likelihood of divorce. So for example, about 1/3 of marriages, the primary reason divorce is sought out is because of infidelity. And I would say that someone who has not had premarital sex, like myself, I did not have sex before marriage, and I'm very grateful for that. That when you live that lifestyle, I got married when I was 28. When you live that lifestyle, you cultivate a virtue of saying no to sex, even when your little lizard brain in the back of your head would say, I'd really like to have sex right now with this person. Uh, you cultivate a discipline to say no to that. And I think then that carries over into marriage, because then when you're married, infidelity and temptation, in fact, I would say the temptation infidelity is higher in marriage, um, because other women see married men as being more attractive than unmarried men. And one reason for that is that, and you can, I don't want to go on too long, but I find this interesting how women view men. That for men, what do men find attractive in women? Typically, it's their looks, their youth, it's things that we can see with our eyes. For women, what they find attractive in men are qualities that primarily are invisible: loyalty, faithfulness, gentleness, hardworking, courageous, virtue, that they're just a good, solid man. And so when they see that a man is married, they know, hey, some other woman trusts this guy. He's not some psycho rapist that keeps her locked up in a basement somewhere. Some other woman has trusted him enough, vetted him. He's valuable. Now I'm kind of interested in him. So if you lived a life where you said no to sex before marriage consistently and developed that discipline, that's very helpful to prevent a major cause of divorce later after marriage, which are the temptations of infidelity. You've lived your post-puberty life saying no to this, and you can continue that in your married life. So I think that's a very good thing.
There's things you said that I agree with. I do agree with the pre-selection argument that women view married men as safer. That's all well and good. But let's say I give you two, like let's say I want like Trent, we're gonna bet $10,000 on this. Here's 100 couples. They're all very religious. Here's 100 couples. They're not religious at all. They've never gone to
Yeah.
church. You don't know anything else about them. They're just picked at random. Who would
Sure.
you bet your money on is more likely to get divorced?
I haven't looked at the studies, but if I had to just take a guess, probably the non-religious.
More likely, yeah, exactly. It's the non-religious people. So that's what I think. Really, again, this is what the author of the study says, and that's my opinion as well. Is that people who have a body count of 0 are much more likely to be religious than people who have a body count of 10. Right? I think that's just very self-evident. So therefore, if being religious, because there's a lot of so for like the average couple is not religious, there's less stigma to divorce nowadays than there is for someone who's very tight knit with their
Well,
church.
I,
You
I
would
don't
have a
know if
lot more stigma for divorcing your wife than I would to divorcing my wife if I had one, right? It just
I don't
keeps
know.
making
I don't
movies.
know. I think that what we see in the literature on the everyone agrees there is a relationship between premarital sex and divorce, and people are trying to explain it. But I was looking at a recent paper from Smith and Wolfinger called "Re-examining the Link Between Premarital Sex and Divorce," and they don't reach a conclusion, but they show this even when you account for early life factors, for these other kind of demographic factors. I think there's something else beyond just the correlative of, oh, well, the people who don't have premarital sex, they are usually very religious.
I'm not
That
saying that's
explains
the
some. Yeah,
I'm not saying that's the only thing. I'm saying that's a big part of the picture. I'm not
that
saying
may
it's the only
you're
thing.
you're right. It may be the case because most people, I think, oh, what is it? I mean, 85% of people have premarital sex. 90%. It depends on the age when you clock it in. So the outliers in that are often going to be religious people, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. That religion can motivate you in virtue to practice virtues, to practice doing what is right, even when it's difficult.
Yeah,
Um,
it depends on
so
what you think is a virtue. So, like, I think that murder, theft, is highly, highly evil and unethical. So therefore, I would say, hey, if religion is keeping people from doing that, then that's a good thing, right? It just we would disagree on whether
well,
premarital sex
let,
is
well, let
immoral or not.
me
Oh wait,
let me ask.
let me sorry,
Go
sorry.
ahead, and I
Let
have a
me just
question, but you can go ahead.
yeah, I just want to address your earlier point because we're having like multiple conversation loops. I do want to try to bring it back. You made a
Sure.
point about Destiny's marriage. And I just want to be clear. I'm not defending Destiny's marriage as like, oh, this is the way you should live your life. I have publicly debated him saying that
Mhm.
your relationship setup, I feel like, is inferior to either being in a one-way open relationship or being a monogamous relationship. So I just want to get that clear. But the reason, if we're actually looking at why his marriage failed, and I'm pretty close with Destiny, I've talked to him about this.
Mhm.
I've seen the videos he's done on this. It wasn't because he was having sex with a woman. It was because she moved in with another guy and also because they were doing long distance for a while. Those are the two main things. Also, there was a lot of lying that led up to this. I don't want to know how much of it has been released yet,
Right.
but there was a lot of lying on, I believe, her part, right? So it wasn't just as simple of like, oh, they had this open marriage. I do know another couple. She's someone who's in my community, Michelle. She has an open marriage. They seem to be doing fine. Again, I'm not arguing that's the optimal way to have a relationship. Like I would never be okay with my wife or girlfriend having sex with another man. But I'm just simply pointing out how
Why?
the whole idea that sex isn't not like one-to-one tied with the reason that a marriage
Why,
might end. But yeah, go ahead.
why wouldn't you be okay with your wife having sex with other men?
The same reason, I mean, to a much larger extent, the same reason I wouldn't eat an In-N-Out, because that the idea of putting fast food in my body kind of grosses me the fuck out. This would be like that times 1,000. The idea of another guy being with my girlfriend grosses me the fuck out. I find it just, ugh. It's like watching my dog get kicked. It just causes this like primal, like, ugh, like if type of response. So I would never be okay with that, right? But I'm not every person. There's some people who I guess don't give a shit or give a shit less. So so people are wired a little bit differently. Now, in terms of the question you had, well, sorry, I'll let you ask your question before I move on to what is sex for.
Yeah, because and this will tie into saying what is sex for. And we could get into your response because I find it a fascinating reason as to why you're not okay with that. But all right, but when it comes to ethics or things being unethical, well, let me ask you this: would you say that it is unethical? Is it unethical for a man to ask his wife for permission to be in an open marriage or to have a threesome or for him just to have an affair? Is it unethical for him to even ask that
At what point in time? Before marriage? After marriage?
after marriage?
Is it on? I don't know if it's like full on unethical. I think it's not ideal. I think that Yeah, I think okay, you can make the arguments unethical because basically the girl was under the impression that you're going to have like a very standard, straightforward, monogamous type of marriage, and then you're basically after you're getting married, you're especially assuming that also she's the type that waits until marriage to have sex, and then she gives you her ultimate gift, as I think women in that position would view it, and you're like, hey, by the way, can I fuck other girls? Just that question in of itself would be insulting. Just like I'm sure it would be insulting to you if your wife was like, hey, Trent, I love you, but is it okay if I have the occasional threesome with a bunch of dudes? Like, so yeah, you can make the argument that that request, it would be insulting. I don't know if it would be like fully unethical. It depends on kind of how you define these things.
Well, and here I'm going to say that I think my view that what sex is for, and then maybe after I reply to this, you can give me your answer to that question, better explains not even that it's unethical, but that it would be just straight up immoral for a husband to ask his wife, hey, can I have an affair with somebody? That he is just flagrantly asking to do something against the very core of what their marriage is. That it's not just, well, when we got married, there was an understanding we would be monogamous, and now you're breaking that, and that's not the plan that I had. That's a minor way to look at it. That'd be like if a husband asked his wife, hey, is it okay if I take this job and we're going to have to move to the other side of the world to do the job? When I'm sure when they got married, they had an implicit understanding they would live on their side of the world, where even if there's an implicit understanding, oh, it's okay, let's ask. And if that's bad, I'm not really feeling that, but I'm glad that you asked. And yet the implicit understanding with sex is just very different because deep down, people know that that sex is for expressing marital love and that marriage is supposed to be monogamous as part of our human nature. And there's something deep within our human nature that no amount of propaganda for open marriage or anything like that can absolve, saying what this is for. It built into just the very being of who we are.
Yeah, but it's not like that with just sex. Like it would be the similar effect if the husband was like, "Hey, is it okay if I become a stay-at-home bum?" Or, "Hey, is it okay if I don't contribute to the kids' well-being at all and you pay all the bills?" Both of those would have a similar type of outcome, which is the girl would
But
feel
notice in
insulted.
those examples, he's asking to do something that's objectively bad. But you don't think that sex outside of marriage is objectively bad.
Well, if we rephrase stay-at-home bum to stay-at-home husband, I don't think that's objectively bad, right? I think that I
And
mean
I
it's
and
kind of
I don't
weird.
think And I don't think it'd be unethical for him to ask to do that. It's certainly not like asking to have
Well,
an
I'm not
affair.
saying it would be unethical. I'm saying it would not. It would be kind of insulting, right? And that's the argument I was making, is that it would be kind of insulting in a lot of marriages if we were to do that. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily like objectively unethical. And I think there's certain insulting questions you can ask your partner that would just piss them the fuck off, right? Okay, let me try to think of another analogy. Another one could be like, hey, so let's say you marry a girl who, I don't know, let's say she suffers some hyperthyroidism and she's like a little bit overweight and she's tried to lose that weight. She can't. It's like, hey, by the way, can you get to single digits body fat? Like, she'll probably find that insulting, right? Or let's say, I don't know, you have you're bald, and she's like, hey, can you wear a wig from now on? Like, you might find that insulting. So there's multiple things that partners can find insulting. It's not just sex related stuff.
Well, yeah, but I would say that asking to have an affair is insulting, but then it goes far beyond that. And the examples you gave are interesting because in asking a spouse to change their physical appearance, that in itself is kind of a breaking of the marital vows if it's done for like a vain reason. That you in the marital vows, and what's important here, and why I think premarital sex is bad. What's important about marriage is that you promise to be monogamous and spend a life together with someone till death do you part. Even if, for example, that the other person gets sick and or disabled and they can't have sex anymore. There, you don't just say, well, sex is just so important to me. I gotta go. You say, hey, you know what? We're married. I'm in this for the long haul, in sickness and health, richer or poor. We're in this till death does us part. So you cherish that other person regardless of who they are and what they become. Everybody gets older, frumpier. And so it breaks that minor vow of loving someone as they are, but the major vow is just not having sex with other people. So it's insulting, but because it's the core element of what makes marriage, it goes beyond just insulting to being immoral to even ask to do such a thing.
Yeah, but it would be a lot more understandable to ask if you can sleep with other women if your partner, for example, becomes crippled and she can't walk, right? And it's been going on like that for 5 years and she's incapable of having sex. At that point, it becomes much more understandable. It
Yeah.
could still be offensive, but it becomes much more understandable to make that request. That's, in fact, when you see those situations, when you see like someone, for whatever reason can't have sex, right? Typically, you see a much higher rate of that person having sex with other people, right? And a lot of the
Sure.
times,
Just
the
yeah,
girl feels good.
just like abortion in the case of rape is in one sense more understandable than abortion just being used as birth control. But from the objective moral law perspective, not just my perspective, both are equally wrong. Actions can be equally wrong, even if one might be more understandable than another. Or
Um,
let's take murder. Murdering a husband to get his insurance money is different than murdering a husband because he's abusive, but not so abusive you can get the police involved and the wife finally snapped and killed him. And not out of self-defense, just because he's just a narcissistic, awful person. That would be more understandable, but both of them are equally wrong. You shouldn't do it.
I wouldn't say they're equally wrong. I think they're both wrong, but one of them is more wrong than the other.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure. Yeah.
it's like the difference between like someone like me who's upper middle class stealing, and someone who's like literally like starving to death. Like
Well, the acts,
it's still
the
wrong
acts
to
are sorry.
steal.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was
The
just gonna say
acts are equal. The acts are both wrong. The culpability, the responsibility is going to differ with the individual circumstance.
yeah, we might go a little bit into semantics here. But anyway, the question that you raised earlier is, what is sex for?
Sure.
And so my answer is that sex, in some ways, is just like working out. It can be used for a lot of different things. For some people, in terms of working out, it's a lifestyle, right? They fucking live for that, right? For some other people, it's a fun hobby, and some others do it purely as a way to stay healthy, and they hate it, right? And I think it's the same thing. Like that for sex in some ways. For you, sex is something that's about. It seems like you're already married, so it's about maintain. It's about either having children or maintaining a strong bond with your partner. Okay, that's totally fine. That's one one thing you can use sex for. For someone like me who's in a relationship, I'm not married, there's some similarity there. It's not to have kids, but it is to number one, have a very pleasurable experience, and number two, keep a strong bond with my girlfriend. But me, like 4 years ago, right, when I was fucking a lot of girls left and right, it was for a way to have fun. It was a fun pastime, kind of like watching football for some people, even though I hate sports, or like playing paintball or something along the lines of that, right? So what sex is for depends on the person, just like what going to the gym is for will depend on the person. So yeah, there's no easy like universal answer to that. It just depends on the person. But there's multiple things that sex can be used for. And I would argue that if you are using sex outside marriage, doesn't mean you're misusing sex.
Okay, so you would say that sex isn't for anything. It's just something that people do because they enjoy it for different reasons.
No, I think that what I said was sex can be used for multiple different things, not just for the things that you mentioned.
Right. It's not for any particular thing. Just like
Well, it's
um,
not,
rec-
no, but it's not for any particular thing. It's for some particular things, right? So, for example, what sex is not for, it's not as a way, it should not, or at least it should not be used as a way to, it should not be used as a way to, let's say, manipulate the person, right? That's what I think sex is not for. Or what it's not for, it's not a form of, I don't know, let's say something like it's not for I don't know, like improving your brain or something like that. So there's many things that sex is not for, right? But it is for some things, and what those things
well, when you
are,
say like improving your brain, you mean that in a non-moral sense. Not that it's wrong to try to do it to improve your brain. It's just not going to achieve that goal.
it's not going to achieve that exactly.
Okay, so
And
yeah,
the
so it's
first
not.
example was more of a moral argument that it shouldn't be used for controlling someone or manipulating someone.
But would you say that you should never use anything to manipulate other people? That it's not sex that's unique in that area?
Yeah, I would agree
Like,
with
you
that.
shouldn't manipulate people with love, you shouldn't use friendship to manipulate people.
Yeah,
So, like,
that's
sex
fair.
isn't unique in that respect.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that when you look at that, if sex has just a subjective purpose to it, that for some people, it can just mean the whole world to them, and for other people, a guy who just has sex with a different woman every night because he likes it. It's a recreational activity on par with going to the gym. I would say that sex can't have an objective meaning to it if everybody has a subjective meaning for themselves. It has no objective meaning. Everybody has their own subjective understanding for that. But I just don't think that that corresponds to what most people understand about basic sexual morality. And you don't have to be religious to believe in sexual morality. If you think it's wrong to commit adultery or be unfaithful, and not just because you've broken a promise, but because that particular action is worse than most promises you could break with someone. I think that has to do with what sex is. Or, for example, we have an entire code of law dedicated to sex crimes. Like, you can you can go to jail for a longer period. You can have a harsher punishment for having sex with an unconscious person and not causing visible, or not even, let's say sex, let's say fondling an unconscious person. And so you don't even leave a bruise or any marks on the person. You could go to jail longer for that than for punching somebody in the face, for causing more visible harm. To me, the only way that could explain why the law would step in and regulate that is because sex has a very specific and important social purpose that's objective. And therefore, government has an interest in regulating it and sanctioning its use in other contexts.
So if the US government completely changed gears and said, hey, actually, from now on, all sex crimes are going to be prosecuted exactly the same way as non sex crimes, then your position would change?
It wouldn't change. I would just say if they're so, like, for example, if the crime of rape just didn't exist anymore, it was just called like penile assault or something, the same as if you slap somebody in the head. Like, if we are
Yeah.
you talking about are you talking about redefining it so sex crimes
No,
just don't really
because
exist?
we have in the legal system, we have sex crimes and we have
Right.
non-sex crimes, right?
Right.
So if sex crimes cease to be prosecuted, now you would still have rape, it would just get prosecuted the same way as battery does, right? So
Right.
if all sex crimes were prosecuted the same way as non-sex crimes,
Right.
then would that change your view? Because the
No,
answer is
it would
no.
just tell me that society has really gone off the rails.
Do you see how by that standard though, like we can't really get anywhere if it's like the standard is, well, because it is this way, therefore that supports my point. But if it was the other way, then I would just think everyone's crazy. You could make the same argument if you're arguing my position.
Well,
Well, yeah,
right.
I would just think society's gone off the rails.
Well, what
Because
about you? You said, for example, that murder is wrong, but what if society changed and said, actually, it's okay to murder this particular minority if they're really bothering you? I'm sure you
well,
would
the
say in that
difference
point,
is that
society's gone off the rails.
you're correct, but the difference is I'm not using what is law to argue for my values, right? There's
No, no,
like, for
yeah.
example, like drugs are illegal, but I think drugs are totally fine in moderation. So I've never throughout this debate used law as a point for why.
No, no, I am not saying law is what makes things moral. What I'm saying is we use the law to enforce morality. Not all moral truths are enforced in the law. For example, like I would say it's wrong to disrespect someone, but I don't need a law that throws people in jail for being disrespectful to others. That would cause way more harm than any good that would outweigh it. But there are other moral evils that are very grave and severe, like or take lying, for example. Like, I'm not going to legally punish every lie, but I
Keep
do
going.
believe the state can. Oh,
No, keep going. Keep going. I'm listening.
oh, but I do think that some lies are so severe, like business fraud, for example, or slander or libel. The government has a role. Those lies cause enough harm to regulate. My point in bringing up the sex crimes is not that because government recognizes sex crimes, that's what makes them distinct and wrong. Rather, it's that what I'm arguing is that when we talk about morality, we often have to start with these basic moral intuitions. Like everybody agrees murder is wrong. Everybody agrees adultery is wrong. And nearly everyone agrees adultery is wrong, this and that. And we start with these basic moral intuitions, and then we try to figure out, okay, well, why is it? Why are these things right or wrong? We have to build a framework around that can explain all of this. And not just right or wrongness, but also things like when it comes to sex, like, can you have sexual disorders? So, for example, like, let me ask you, if sex is kind of recreational for people, do you think there's any consensual sex that can be disordered?
What do you mean by disorder?
Like, to put it colloquially, that's effed up. You shouldn't do that. Like, for example, there are eating disorders, right? Like someone who eats food and vomits it up, we would call that an eating disorder. Or somebody who they have pica disease, they eat glass or they eat dirt. We would say that's an eating disorder.
Yeah, I'm
That's
sure. I'm
not
sure. I'm sure there's something like fucking cutting your dick off or something like that. Yeah, I'm sure there's something we could find for sex that would say is effed up. But if we're just following your train of logic, most people don't agree sex is only something that can be used in marriage, nor is premarital sex illegal. So if we were
right.
to just, again, if I was to give you internal critique, if we were to kind of follow that, like, well, morality is intricately tied into the law, which is not something I personally believe in. But again, that seems to be like what you're arguing. Then that would still support my point because premarital sex is fully legal and most people think it's fine.
Mhm. No, well, most people would think that it doesn't mean they think it's fine. They could just mean, like, for example, I don't think premarital sex should be illegal because while it is harmful, uh, equipping the power of the police to detain, imprison people, and to surveil people in order to find them guilty of such a crime would cause more harm than it tries to prevent. Same with adultery, for example, throwing people in jail for committing adultery. Now, I do think that there can be civil aspects, like you commit adultery, you get raked over the coals in divorce court, for example, and things like that. But my point with the law is just that when we're trying to understand what moral system makes sense, we have these basic moral intuitions. And if sex is just whatever somebody thinks it is, the state doesn't really have any kind of interest in severely punishing assaults based on sex because it's sex. They could just talk about how much bruising happened, how much injury. But I think people have this general moral intuition about sex that doesn't make sense under your
Well,
worldview.
we're not really debating sex crimes. I think you and I both agree that sex crimes are wrong and unethical. We're talking about consensual sex between two adults. And I just quickly pulled up a study, and it says that 95% of people had sex before marriage. And even when we look at NIH data from 2002, which is, as you know, things have become more, it's become more and more accepted. But if we look at just 2002, It says that 70%. Okay, wait, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Yeah, so I think I saw that 70% or 60%, something like 70, 75% believe that premarital sex. Oh yeah, 69% response in the United States believe premarital sex to be morally acceptable. So the majority of people, if we're just following like, okay, well, majority of people can feel the type of thing. The majority of people think that premarital sex is morally acceptable. We're not even talking about being made illegal. That would be a
Right.
tiny, tiny fraction of
Right.
people. And I guess
Well, let me jump in on that. When I talk about moral intuitions, I'm not saying that they're infallible. I'm not saying that just what everybody thinks about morality is always right. But when I'm trying to figure out a moral view, like let's take for abortion, for example, like you could bring up a study that says, look, 25% of people think it's always wrong, 50% of people think it's sometimes wrong, and 25% of people think it's never wrong. Okay, when it comes to abortion. But everybody has a basic intuition it's wrong to kill children. It's wrong to kill young human beings. So I would start with that or moral intuition we all share and say, hey, wait a minute, if you think it's wrong to kill human beings, but then what are the unborn? I might try to clear up a factual dispute. And then their moral intuition, they'll say, oh, yeah, I guess I got to be against abortion if a human fetus is a young child, is a human being. Likewise, with premarital sex, you're correct. There could be, there's just like with abortion, there's a majority of people in favor of it in some forms. There's probably a majority of people see nothing wrong with premarital sex, but I might say, okay, but you have these other intuitions about what sex is for, the wrongness of infidelity, how sex can be disordered. Like if somebody wants to have sex with an inanimate object, they probably are disordered. That's not what sex is for. Or they want to have sex with animals, for example. Say, hey, that's not what sex is for. Oh, well, what is sex for? Then I would help them see you have these basic moral intuitions that will lead you more to my view of what sex is for. And then you're going to have to rethink your other intuitions as a result.
Yeah, I don't think it follows. There's many reasons why sex crimes might be prosecuted more severely and why it might make sense. For example, let's think about the fact that if you rape a girl, that might cause her way more internal harm than if you punch her in the face.
Well, I gave the example of fondling her when she's unconscious. Like, which is worse, touching someone's chest when they're sleeping or punching somebody in the face?
For like in my worldview,
Yeah.
I think they're probably both equally wrong. I think I don't know. It depends on how hard you punch that person in the face. What's the reason for the punch? Did they start? Did you start it? Who's the person that
I thought it'd
you
be fun. I thought it'd be Bob thought it would be funny to punch Frank in the face. And then Frank is sleeping and Lucy is sleeping. Bob thought it'd be funny to squeeze Frank's pectoral muscle, and he thought it'd be funny to squeeze Lucy's breast while they're both sleeping. But two of those are a crime, even though only one of them caused injury. And with Lucy, it's because it involved a sexual organ, which I find very curious, which would show this prima facie importance of sex I was talking
I
about
would
before.
probably think that punching someone in the face is more wrong because there's with that you can literally knock them out and kill them. With grabbing a breast, you're probably not going to kill someone, but they're both wrong. It's just
Or slapping someone in the face.
yeah, I think at that point it becomes like a break even. I think they're both like kind of messed up, but they're like not that big of a deal. But when we talk about sex crimes, we typically think of like actual like sexual assault, right, or rape and things like that. We don't really typically, colloquially use that term to associate with like, oh, this is gonna be funny if I just grab her titty, right? Most of that goes unprosecuted
No, it
anyway.
can. Like, for example, if you film a woman undressing, if you secretly film a woman undressing and you secretly film a woman just in her living room reading a book, only one of those is a sex crime, and it's going to be punished much more severely as a result, even though you're doing the same thing, you're letting a camera run.
Yeah, but then again, like I look at that, we prosecute people for literally smoking weed, and so a lot of them go to jail. So I don't really care what the law is in terms of determining what is right and wrong in terms of
Well,
my morality.
let's move away from that then, and we could
And
talk
then
about.
wait, just let me
Go ahead
really
though. If there's one thing else you want to go at, go ahead.
no, just really quickly, just to restate this again,
Mhm.
if we're going to use the law as any kind of indicator of what is right or wrong, or any kind of way for it to be tied into these two things, then I think we can't ignore the fact that number one, having premarital sex is fully legal, and number two, the majority of people think it's okay, and the vast majority of people do it, right? So then that you can make an argument. Well, if we talk about sex crimes, that's much more indirect, right? But if we just look at
Well,
the actual debate proposition, which is premarital sex. It's legal. Most people think it's okay. So therefore, that doesn't really help your argument at all. It would
Well,
only
I
help
would say
the
that
argument.
just because it's legal and most people think it's okay, that would do nothing to show whether it's bad. For example, it's legal to eat at McDonald's, and most people think it's okay to do that. But I think overall McDonald's is probably bad for people.
Exactly. Just so I think how much of a sentence you get for sex crime doesn't really do much to tell you whether it's good or
Well,
bad.
let's just shift away from that then. If we're talking about whether because we can talk about there's two different things. We can talk about whether premarital sex is wrong and we can talk about whether it's bad. And I gave different arguments for why it's wrong based on the outcomes of harm that can cause to other people, like the children who often come into existence from premarital sex, the injury you cause to yourself, the inability to bond later with a spouse, things like that. So there's the wrongness there, and then there's just the badness, which you were talking about with outcomes before, saying, oh, you know what, it's going to lead to an outcome we don't really like. It's painful or not enjoyable. So we don't want to do that, such as, for example, marriage is more likely ending in divorce, for example, or, getting an STD, getting a sexually transmitted disease, other things like that. So I could say that even if I agree with you, lots and lots of people have premarital sex. Lots of people think there's nothing wrong with it. But when people look at a lot of the consequences that come from it, they'll say, yeah, that's if I could not have sex and have a long, fulfilling marriage, like, and if and not having sex was good for me, I think a lot of people would want to do that if it could be shown, hey, this is actually a healthier and a better way to live, similar to not eating sugar, flour, McDonald's, other stuff that's legal and widely supported, but it's just kind of ultimately bad for you because you're not wired for it.
Yeah, hopefully you don't mind me asking this somewhat personal question, but did you have premarital sex or did you wait until marriage?
Oh, I did mention that earlier. No, I did not have premarital sex.
Okay, you're an exception because pretty much every single person I've debated on this topic has said, yeah, I had premarital sex, but then I changed my mind after I got married. So, okay, I'll give you props for at least being consistent with the stuff that you say. I'm curious, if you were trying to steel man my argument, what would you say are the benefits that I would list for having premarital sex?
Sure. And then maybe you could steel man mine for the benefits of not having it.
Sure.
Uh, I would say the benefits of premarital sex would probably be it's a pleasurable act. So you may have feelings of pleasure. Sex is an enjoyable thing. Uh, that's one of the big things that makes marriage such a great relationship. So I would say that one of the benefits might be that sex is enjoyable and you can feel close affection for another person. But as I said before, just because something might have some pleasurable benefits, if you look at the overall harms, that can easily outweigh it. And you can look at just the act itself is just wrong. So, like, I, as a pro-life person, I can say, yeah, there could be benefits to abortion, and that you don't have to drop out of school, you don't have to take care of a child. But that's easily outweighed by the cons of abortion, which is it's really, really bad for people and the lives of their own children. So I guess I can identify some benefits. I mean, people obviously choose sex, they choose things because they see a good in it in some way. But often the good is either distorted or the harms are obscured.
Yeah, so that's I guess I should have clarified. I mean, more like long-term benefits. That's I have a list of three. That wasn't on
Okay.
my list. So
Yeah, I'm
here,
not sure of the long-term benefits.
yeah. So I'll explain. So number one, you're dating and marrying this girl that you're with because you really like her, and your perception of her isn't be distorted by your desire to fuck her. Right? We men have a tendency that we will overlook a lot of things just because we're horny, and that completely eliminates that from the equation. You're truly going to marry this girl, or you're truly dating her. Not because you want to fuck her, right? And again, you can logically say, well, I don't think it's that, but subconsciously, you might still be motivated by that. And you might have these rosy goggles on, but truly because you really, really like her and you're thinking more from a logical place. That's one. Number two, you're sexually compatible. And that also is quite important. This is a big one. If you're into super vanilla shit and she likes BDSM, this won't work long term. Now, of course, you can counter that and say, well, you can talk about this stuff beforehand. I guess in theory you could. But if it's someone who's a virgin, then she's not even going to know what she likes until she has sex a few times, right? So yeah, I mean, it was anecdotal, but there's plenty of cases of women who were virgins, got married, started having sex, realized that their husband is into like super boring shit, they like more exciting shit, and got into their whole phase, right? And that whole thing could have been avoided if they just had premarital sex. And number three, this is something that would be a big argument in the manosphere. I personally don't think this is as important if you're someone who's very socially aware and self-aware, but is that she really, really likes you, right? Is that the girl, because again, for a girl to have sex, that's the ultimate form of investment, generally speaking. So if she has sex with you before marriage, that means that it's very likely, at least, or it's more likely that she's just not using you to get married. She doesn't just want 50% of your money. Now, again, you can make the counter argument, well, yeah, but maybe to her, sex is something that's just irrelevant. And for those girls, sure. But for the girls who value sex very highly, who value chastity very highly, her giving you her ultimate gift would be a pretty strong indicator that she really likes you for you and is not just with you for ulterior motives. But primarily, I would focus on the first one and the second one. I think those two are the biggest.
Yeah, I have a hard time even wrapping my head around the third one. Is the third one just by having premarital sex, you can see she's not just trying to get married? I was having a hard time wrapping my head around the red pill one.
Yeah, so like for example, there's cases where women will kind of withhold sex as a way of gaining something from that guy. That could be a green card, that could be marriage because the guy's risk and they want to have access to his assets if things don't work out. It could be any number of things. But women, there are some women. Now I do think the red pillers overblow how many, but there are some women who do use sex as a form of control and manipulation, right? And if you have sex with her before marriage, then you can be assured that at least the sex isn't being used in the fairest way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to agree. There are women who use sex to manipulate men, just as there are men who manipulate women to get sex. I would say that's, you're going to find bad people on both sides of that.
Yeah, but primarily, like for me, from my
let's go to 1 and 2. I think those are stronger.
Those are the ones at least that I feel like are most interesting. Now, do you want me to steel man your arguments first, or do you want?
Yeah, we can go into these. These are more interesting.
Okay,
is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you want to start?
Well, okay. Let's start with the first one. I think it's a little simpler than the second one. I agree with you. I mean, people can get married for all kinds of wrong reasons. There's lots of people. My wife and I, we were dating for about a year and a half. We were engaged for a year and a half. So about a 3-year process to discern, like, should we really get married? Like, we want to see each other in a wide variety of settings. We're not having sex, which I would say is a really good thing, honestly, to keep our heads straight. Because a lot of times people have sex and they're like, this person's amazing. And they go get married. It's like, actually, that was just the oxytocin in your body, lighting up all the electrical circuits in your brain.
That's like that for women. I'm talking about men. For men, typically, that's why men
get hooked.
Well, I mean, there's this whole idea with men that it's like you want, like, after you come, you want like nothing to do with the girl. It's like this is why that joke is so popular on the internet, or post-nut clarity, I think, as it's called colloquially.
Yeah, but yes. I've also known, frankly though, I've known guys who have had, dated a girl, had sex with her, and then like she breaks up with them, and they're like a freaking mess, even worse than like girls who get dumped by a guy they have sex with. So I don't think
there's an exception, but generally speaking, women are the ones that become more bonded after sex than the average man does. Of course, there's exceptions. Of course, there's guys who do have a high oxytocin release, but I think that potential risk is outweighed by the whole premise that a lot of guys make decisions with their dick. I mean, we see it all the fucking time, right? And so a lot of guys might be in a relationship or even get married because they're like, fuck, I really want to sleep with this girl. And they might not be conscious of it. It might be subconscious. It doesn't mean it's not there. And then they get married, they sleep with a girl, and they're like, wait, what the hell am I doing? I don't even really have anything in common with her.
Yeah, what I would say is that this is just a sign of a man who lacks maturity, that sex is not something to solve a problem that you have per se. Now, for example, like in marriage, like if a husband and wife are fighting about something and then they have sex, that little amnesia effect can actually be helpful, because like, what were we even fighting about? Like that was stupid. Why were we even fighting about that. That's not a big deal. So that can be helpful in marriage. But I think if a guy is like so revved up and horny, he's like, oh, I just got to get this out of my system. I would say that if he's relying on sex to not have that immature attitude, uh, I would say that having sex and then getting married, that immature attitude is still going to follow him into marriage. Because he could be married to that girl and still feel that crazy feeling to one of his coworkers. He's like, oh man, if I just had sex with her, then I'll realize she's not that great a deal and I can get over this. Like, no, dude, you gotta just be able to learn self-control. So I think that the problem here, the long-term benefit is from a faulty solution to a real problem, not from what I would call the actual solution to it.
Yeah, this might not be perfectly analogous, but if you're really hungry, do you think you can make equally good logical decisions? Just you personally.
No, yeah, if you're hunger affects the body in different ways, like when your blood sugar drops to keep you from being rational. And if you are sexually frustrated, that can keep you from making rational decisions. However, if you are just a slave to your desires, it is possible for you to grow in discipline so that hunger doesn't become hanger. It doesn't become cloudiness. Like I practice intermittent fasting, for example, that when you're hungry, you can use that to develop a mental clarity, much the same way that you can develop a mental clarity even when you're sexually frustrated to do other things like work out, do martial arts, do other things with how you're feeling to manage this instead of just giving into getting the burger or the babe to solve how you're feeling. Go after the deeper root of the problem.
Yeah, if you're going to argue though earlier on that most people don't use condoms properly, I would just make the same exact argument: is that most people are not disciplined. I mean, do you think most people have that level of discipline? I don't.
No, most people are not disciplined, but that's why I wouldn't say, since most people aren't disciplined, eat like crap, don't exercise, just be happy with who you are. I might say, look, this is the best way to live. Not a lot of people are going to choose it, but choosing in this way, this will bring happiness in accord with our human nature.
But it doesn't have to be black or white like that. You could just avoid yourself from getting really hungry, and that's why there's the whole like meme that people typically cheat on their diets when they're really hungry. It's like, oh man, I was doing like whatever this diet for 3 months, and I got really really hungry, and I ate a cheeseburger.
It depends. So it's like, look, if I'm hungry and I just can't think, I'm gonna eat. I'll get some carrots and some ranch or whatever, and I'm gonna eat that. And it's like, and this is a good thing for me. It's good for my body. But there are times when, like, I'm giving up when I give up flour or sugar, and I'm really, really hungry, and I can't think straight. And I look over, and I see, I look at my mind, I see the McDonald's down the road, or I see the chocolate cake on the counter, and I'll say, "Oh, I'm really hungry." No, that's poison for me. It might make me less hungry right now and have a short-term benefit, but long-term, it's going to crash my sugar. It's going to put on extra pounds. I'm going to suffer now, so I don't have to suffer more later. And I think that's the same attitude one should take with premarital sex.
Right, but marriage is a very important commitment. You agree with that, right?
It is an important commitment. So that's what. But I don't think that having sex before marriage aids you in the discernment of that, or maybe it aids you slightly. Who knows? For like a little bit right after you have sex. But even there, you could make the bad decision of like, oh, I'm really, really worked up. You have sex with a girl. I'm not really that into her. You break up, and then a month later, you're like, what the hell was I thinking? She was really good for me. I was just, in a weird mood after having sex. The emotions we have, ancient Greek philosophers compared them to horses in a chariot. And so the chariot should be driving the horses, not the horses driving the chariot. And that's where that's why I am just ultimately skeptical of this being some kind of long-term benefit, using premarital sex to discern if this is a good spouse for you. There's just far more effective ways to do that. And premarital sex is just much more likely to undermine that goal than to support it.
Yeah, but if we agree that most people aren't disciplined, which seems like we do, and a lot of guys think with their dick, then wouldn't it be better to get that out of your system before you make the most important decision, or one of the most important decisions of your life, so that your thinking is not being influenced by your subconscious desire to bust a nut?
No, I would say I wouldn't recommend this because I still think that it's wrong. But like, you can. Well, I'm not even going to recommend this. Like, if somebody needs
ethics aside, just purely from an outcomes-based perspective.
No, yeah. Well, from an outcomes-based perspective, I'm going to say, if you're not sure whether you should marry this person, then you shouldn't be having sex with them, because you could get them pregnant and it's not negligible. I know, like you're saying, oh, well, not everybody's disciplined. And I'm going to say to you, not everybody uses so-called foolproof contraceptives. So like if you're worried about whether you should even marry this person, how is that going to be complicated if you end up having a child with that person?
Well, this is not really the argument I'm making. I'm talking about a guy who is sure they're going to marry that person, right? But then their thinking is being influenced by their horniness, right? By their sex drive. And then once they have sex with that person, they get
Sorry,
out
let
of
me
their system.
rephrase. Not that they're sure, but they're sure they want to marry that person, but they're not sure if they've made the best decision to marry them. Is that what you
Well,
mean?
they might, no, not exactly, because they might think at the time that, hey, I'm making the best decision possible. But then after they have sex and they have some post-nut clarity, they think and they're like, hey, actually, I don't really have much in common with this person. My desire to marry her was largely influenced by my desire to have sex. Again, you're most of the time you're not conscious of it.
Well, what I would say is that you would be conscious of the fact, if you are that sexually frustrated, horny, to use a word, we're being salty with our language in this style, more than my normal dialogues. That is an enduring problem with your temperament and character that's going to require discipline and practice to temper and overcome. That just having sex isn't going to be the solution to that. But do you want to go on to point 2, to sexual compatibility?
Yeah, we can if you want. I just want to just say one more thing on that, and
Go ahead.
obviously you can respond. I feel like we're a little bit all over the place with this kind of this when we're talking about this point. I don't think that, because like most people aren't disciplined, and I would agree with you that it would be better if most people were disciplined. But if we're giving advice, like if you're a nutrition counselor or a fitness trainer or something like that, right? And someone's trying a diet that they know is good for them, right? What's the advice you would give them? You'd say, well, avoid getting too hungry to begin with. Have your carrots on you or whatever the fuck diet you're trying to do, because if you get too hungry, that's when the likelihood of you making a bad decision might be. And then afterwards, you're like, shit, why did I do that? Right after you eat that cheeseburger, you're like, shit, why the fuck did I do that? Well, marriage is like that on steroids. Marriage is like that times 1,000, because it's really, really a big decision. We both agree on that. So therefore, you will want to eliminate any chance that you're subconsciously being led the wrong way by your sexual desires, or even consciously to some extent. That's why that would be a practical benefit to having premarital sex. The only way you could counter that is if you say like, well, yeah, but then that's equally as likely to happen as someone, being overly committed to a girl because of the oxytocin release that happens after sex. But again, that's just not how it works with guys.
Mm-hmm.
Most guys, that's why there's a whole idiom of a post-nut clarity, right? It's not post-nut attachment.
But would you agree then in this argument it doesn't work for women though? Because they're going to make, because that they don't get clarity after having sex, because they get that super attachment.
Yeah, this argument does not work for women, it just works for men.
Right. Okay. So we're talking about just a specific group here. But even there, my final reply before we go on is just that I disagree with the assessment that having sex with someone gives you some kind of Zen-like, I am now the wise master who can objectively see the world around me and make the right decision. You're just swinging the pendulum from one agitated emotional state that keeps you from thinking clearly, which is extreme sexual frustration, to another agitated emotional state where you have a lot of hormones that are going. You have the change in your sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system after you have sex. I would say that when you're making big decisions, and I'm sorry, it's like, well, not everybody's disciplined. Yeah, not everybody aims to live their best life in virtue and health, but we can know what the right path is and we can aim for that. And so we should aim for finding that objective middle ground of tempering our passions so that we can make the best decisions in life, especially when it comes to discerning marriage and things like that.
Well, that middle ground would be having sex with her maybe once or twice or 3 times, right? And not doing it too often. That would be like the middle ground there. We're both arguing kind of extremes in terms of this debate.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, the middle. Yeah, it's not like the middle ground is like, well, the middle ground for murder, it's like you can murder 1 million people or no people. The middle ground is just like 2 people you really hate. So like, the middle ground can still be none.
I don't know how that would be a middle ground, but okay. But I just reject this idea that the opposite of post-nut clarity, that equally as likely as to happen is that you get overly attached to a girl. That's just not there's no science to support that. That's not in line with any guy I've ever talked to. I do agree with you. It can work like that for women. I just don't think it works like that for men.
Okay.
But we can move on to the second point if you want.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the second one I would say does apply actually to men and women. So yeah, I mean, where do you want to start with that one?
Okay, you talked about premarital sex can be helpful to determine sexual compatibility,
Yes.
and I don't know what you mean by that term.
I mean, it's basically exactly what it sounds like. People have different sexual kinks. People have different sexual styles that they like. And if you are kind of an opposite end of that spectrum, like you're someone, for example, who's, let's say, like super kinky shit, or you're just not even that kinky, you just like BDSM, and she likes super plain, lights off vanilla sex, that's going to be an issue. Or if you flip that equation, the girl is the one that likes the kinky shit, that's going to be an issue, right? So that's what I mean in terms of that. It's just like some girls you're sexually compatible with, and some that you're not.
Okay, because for me, at the most basic, because what's interesting is I can agree with this term, not agree with having premarital sex, but I agree in certain respects, sexual compatibility is important in marriage in a broad sense. So, for example, the ability to
Brent, just
have
real
sex.
quick, I do
Yeah,
appreciate
sorry.
you saying that, because when I was debating Andrew on this, his response was, "What is sexual compatibility? I don't even know what it means, man. Like, what is it? I've never heard of it." So I do appreciate you, as someone who waited until marriage to have sex, to actually understand sexual compatibility. But
Well,
uh,
and this is something, this has been a journey for myself, right? I mean, I was your, virgin is nervous on his wedding night, like, all right, we're gonna see how this goes. And it's a learning process, but it's great that you are learning because sex is an expression of marital love. You learn how to express that love in marriage. And what marriage is really, marriage is a lifelong learning process. Marriage is about learning how to live with someone, how to care for someone, how to communicate with someone. And so it does take a long time to develop you might be doing well dating wise, but you're never going to perfectly vet somebody. In dating, you should just make sure there's no obvious red flags that this is going to be a real problem. But otherwise, you're going to grow in emotional compatibility, you're going to grow in social compatibility, you're going to grow in sexual compatibility, and you're going to make compromises along the way when it comes to different preferences, whether it's sexual or non-sexual. But I don't think that it's necessary, the harms that come from, in like, for one, I don't think you could find this out. I think you mentioned this earlier, like by talking through. I think people should talk about sex. Like if you're engaged and you talk about sex and the other person says, yeah, I never actually really have a desire to have sex with you. Like I never like feel sexually excited at all. I'm not really excited to have sex with you. That's gonna be a red flag right there. Right. And you should figure that out. But you can figure that out by talking to the person during the engagement process. But when it comes to compatibility, so what I said in the broad sense, to be married, you need to physically be able to have penis and vagina sex. So, like in the Catholic Church, for example, if you're impotent, permanently impotent, like it's impossible for some reason you didn't know before marriage to have vaginal intercourse, you can actually have that annulled. Because in the Catholic Church, you're married, but you don't become an indissoluble bond until you've had sex. Uh, so there needs to be that compatibility in that front. Now, when it comes to having sex, it's like, okay, what makes this person feel good? What makes that person feel good? I would just say you don't, the harms of doing that before sex easily outweigh any benefits of figuring that out. And you're probably not going to figure that out the few times you have sex before marriage, because your whole life, well, let me give you this example. Imagine, you had premarital sex with someone a few times and you're like, man, they're bad at sex. I never want to be married to them. But what if you would marry that person? And let's say you spend the first 2 or 3 years of marriage, it's kind of rough, and you've sorted out and figure out how to be compatible and you grow together. And then now you spend the next 50 years of your life having a really sexually fulfilling marriage. I think if you have that narrow mindset about it, you can just be really missing out on a lot.
Yeah, like let's say you and I are starting a business together. If we're slightly different, we can probably make it work. We can find a middle ground, right?
Yeah.
We can adapt to each other's style. But if you and I are totally different, like for example, I think that it's totally okay to lie on our taxes, and I think it's okay to lie to customers, and I think it's okay to do this and that. And you're like, whoa, I'm not okay with any of that. Or let's say I have a much more loose style of business where I'm like, yeah, let's just fucking invest our money everywhere. And you're like, whoa, you're very like anti-risk, you're very like conservative in terms of business style. There's not always a middle ground. So it depends on how far off you are. And yeah, sometimes you can find a middle ground, but if you're, at least moderately far off, if not significantly far off, then you probably won't find a middle ground.
But also, well, I think you can though. I think when it comes to these different preferences, when it comes to married sex, there's a fairly wide latitude as long as you're not using, or abusing the other person when it comes to what's sexually appropriate. Some people are going to have maybe more of an aggressive style of sexuality. Others might be more passive. It's always awkward to talk about hypothetical people having sex and things like that. But I think that, you gave the example of vanilla, I guess more traditional sex, one that might have more aggression in it, kink, things like that. I think that this is going to come up in anything in marriage. Like you get married and maybe you share, like my wife and I, we have different interests. Some interests we share. Other things are things that I enjoy, and I don't make her do it. I don't make her go to jujitsu with me because I'd love for her to go. I keep asking, but I'm not going to force it. I'm not going to divorce her over it because, hey, she don't like it.
But you guys have enough. You guys have enough overlap in your sex life or your sexual desires that it's a satisfying experience for both of you.
But that's anything in marriage. Like, I think that when it comes to those, you have different sexual preferences. You're going to learn from one another. Also, if you don't have premarital sex and you're not, using pornography a bunch, it's less likely you're going to have these varied and oftentimes unrealistic expectations of what should be present. But even in the example you gave, vanilla and kink, it's like, well, maybe one person, the vanilla, can learn to be a little bit more aggressive and take charge, especially if that's the man. And the woman can learn to accept his assertiveness without some of the other aspects that might be more that he could rightfully say are degrading.
Yeah, a big reason I've seen for divorce is one or both people not being sexually satisfied. And if you have, sure, what you're saying is nice in theory. And I think that if there's a mild to maybe even moderate discrepancy, that can work. But I'm not talking about expectations. I'm talking about pleasures. I'm talking about what you find sexually satisfying. There's some people, for example, for whom vanilla sex, just regular sex, does absolutely nothing. It doesn't turn them on, doesn't make them orgasm, does nothing for them. Mm-hmm. And there's some people who want all that. And you said it's kind of hard to talk about hypotheticals in terms of this. I agree. This is why I can give my anecdotal experience. And I can tell you this, there was a time in my life, I think when I was about 24, 25, 26, when what I was doing is I was having sex with a lot of married women that I would meet on various websites and dating apps.
Wait. Can you rewind a bit? Did you say married women?
Yeah, women who were married. I was having sex.
You were having sex with married women.
Yes, there's a period of my life. I no longer do that. But the point I was making is that every
progress,
time,
at least.
every time. Well, I don't feel guilty about it per se. It's just not something I want to do. But the point I'm making is that when I would lay in bed with that girl and I would be like, hey, I'm just curious, like, what made you decide to sleep with me? Like, why did you step out on your husband? Because a lot of times I would kind of prod a little bit. I'd be like, so what's your husband like? And they would paint a pretty good picture. It's like, this dude's rich. He's in good shape. He's like this and that. I'm like, damn, dude sounds cooler than me, honestly. Like, why are you sleeping with me? And pretty much every single time the answer was always the same. Yeah, he just doesn't sexually satisfy me. We tried for years. The one extreme example was this hot MILF. She was basically saying, yeah, he has a whole pee fetish, and his whole thing is that he wants me to follow a special diet and then piss in his mouth, and that's the only way he can get off. It doesn't turn me on. I want to have sex. I don't want to pee on him. That's an extreme example. But
that's a reasonable expectation, I would say. I would not want to be peed on either. The only time that happens when I got to change my baby's diapers. And
that's because you don't have a pee fetish, Trent. Neither do I. But for two people to have a pee fetish, for someone who has a pee fetish, the best partner is someone who also has a pee fetish, right?
Yeah, but just because you have a fetish doesn't mean you have a right to have that fetish entertained. I told you about that cannibal guy he has a cannibal fetish before. Well, guess what? You're just going to have to stuff that deep down, go to therapy, and cut that right out the door. Some fetishes, you just have to realize they're disordered, and you've brought something disordered into your marriage, and you have to seek healing so you don't hurt your spouse with it.
I don't think we can. So we can make that analogy for like I don't know if you have a fetish like cutting off limbs or something like that. I can only come if I cut off your finger or something like that, or if I blind you, right? But I don't think we can tie a pee fetish, which is while being super gross, doesn't actually cause any harm
How about
to
do you
cannibalism
think
and murder.
do you think it's degrading, or how about a poop fetish? I only get off, I got to poop on your chest. Like that's I would say that.
Vince McMahon style. It's not my thing, bro. Not find it
But
fucking gross, but
well,
no,
that yeah, but
I don't think it
no, but
causes harm.
I find you know, certain, you know, foods like balut, fertilized duck eggs, to be gross, for example. But I don't think people who eat balut are degrading themselves. So I think there's a difference here that we can see that something might gross out our sensibilities. Like there's African tribes that drink goat's blood because it's an easy portable way to have hydration in the desert. That grosses me out. I don't think I could drink goat's blood. But I would say that's not degrading. I would say taking a poop on your partner because that's what gets you off, that's degrading to them. And so I think that part of sexual compatibility, especially if you have previous porn use and premarital sex, is going to be to purge many of the things that are, like I asked you before, are there things that are disordered when it comes to sex? I think these are clear examples and part of just sexual compatibility. It's not about, well, you can talk about these things, you can find out. Do you watch porn? What kind of porn do you like watching? You don't even have to have sex to figure that one out. And then number two, you know, you can do therapy and do things to sort this stuff out. It's gross.
Yeah, so so I'm not arguing in favor of like fucking shitting on people's chests, but to someone who has a poop fetish, it's not going to be degrading. It's going to be like highly satisfying. I don't know who those people are, but they do
No, no,
exist.
no. It's like the desire that they can only get off by defecating on their partner. They're treating their partner like a toilet.
No, but if their
That,
partner is into being shitted on, then it's a different story, right?
but here's
Then
the thing: can people, like, for example, if a woman on OnlyFans has group sex with like 20 dudes and sells that to people, you know, would you say that even though she's voluntarily doing it and says she likes it, you can still degrade yourself even if you voluntarily consent to things?
Potentially, yes, but degradation
Okay.
is subjective. It is subjective. What you might find degrading is not something that I would find degrading. What your wife might find degrading is not something my girlfriend might find degrading. I think there will probably be like a 98% overlap, but there's not perfect overlap, right? So
Well, well,
it is subjective.
yeah, I just
There's some
disagree. I
just
disagree
really
with
quick,
that. Go ahead. Go
for
ahead.
like
Go ahead.
some women, literally being in one, like having one guy videotape them fucking them and sharing with their friends might be extremely degrading. For another woman, that might not be degrading at all. It might be funny, right? So it is subjective, what is degrading and what is not.
In some sense, there's going to be on the margins, there's going to be a subjective judgment, but you can also make objective judgments that some sexual behavior is degrading or disordered, and so it's wrong. So, for example, a woman who commits bestiality by letting her dog lick peanut butter out of her vagina, for example, or
But
does other,
Trent,
or no, hold on, let me finish, or doing other kinds of bestiality that is non-penetrative bestiality that doesn't harm the animal. I mean, honestly, we eat animals. If you eat animals, what's the big deal about getting off on them? I think people deep down would say, "Oh, it's not. Oh, she doesn't think it's degrading." They would say, "That's not what sex is for. You're perverted. That's not right." But if the view is that sex is just a recreational thing, there's no ground for you to say that that's objectively disordered. You can only say it grosses you out, like certain food preferences, not that it's objectively wrong.
but you're missing the big reason why it's wrong. The reason it's wrong by most people's standards is because the animal can't consent. You're not having it, just like the reason why it's wrong to have someone sex with a woman who's drunk, or the reason it's wrong to have sex with someone who's underage. They cannot consent. An animal cannot consent unless you can speak to animals
Is it?
somehow, which no one can. So that's really at the crux of why the vast majority of people think it's wrong.
I think that doesn't make I don't agree with that on multiple fronts. Is that's the reason why? That's not a good answer. So, for example, uh, animals can't consent to being eaten, but we still eat them, right? Without their consent.
Yes, sure.
So, if we can cause the greater harm of eating them, why not the lesser harm of sex?
Well, because the people would argue, and there's vegans who argue literally the point you're trying to make, which is that it's actually just as wrong to eat an animal. So there are people who hold that worldview,
I
but
don't think
generally,
you do.
no, I don't. I eat meat, but generally the kind of logic I follow is I think comes down to two things. Number one is that we eat meat. Like this is something that we need to sustain us, right? Now you can make the argument like, oh, but you can, maybe take supplements, blah blah. But all supplements aside, I think a paleo diet is much healthier for you than a vegan diet. That's a primary reason why I'm paleo and not vegan. That's the first thing. But the second thing, which I think is also really really big, is how far removed you are from from the harm. So I personally don't think I have it in myself to go hunting in the woods and shoot an animal. But I have no problem eating an animal, right? But I just can't bring it in myself to murder an animal. So that it's the same thing here. But when it comes, so that's the reason most people are okay with eating meat is because they're not actually watching the cows get killed. And if they were to do that, quite often at the time they'd be like, fuck that, I'm not eating meat anymore. And there's a lot of stories of guys saying like, or vegans saying like, yeah, I used to be pro meat. Then I went to like the slaughterhouse. I saw how it was done. And I was like, I can never do this again. I mean, for me personally, I remember.
But is it you're saying though, but here's what's interesting. You would say it's not disordered to eat meat. If anything, it's ordered.
I don't know if I would argue it's ordered or disordered. I would argue that's a healthier way to live your life. And I would also argue that it's very easy to justify that murder of animals when you're so far removed from it. I think it's a lot harder to justify it when you're literally right there in the slaughterhouse. And I would say that if most people, like before eating a steak, you have to watch it get killed, a lot of people would not eat that steak. Versus when you're having sex with an animal, number one, it is not the optimal way to live your life, obviously. And number
Why?
two, why is it not the optimal way to live your life to have sex with animals? Well,
Right.
there's the social ostracization. Like people who eat meat, they're not socially ostracized. People who have sex with animals are massively socially ostracized. Number two, I think that it's just. Let me try and think of how to explain it. I think just like for any sane person, having the idea of having sex with animals, just like, oh, this is like fucking disgusting, repugnant. Versus most people, except vegans, don't get that reaction when it comes to eating meat. So that's that. But the other point that I was making is not what just if
Go
I could
ahead.
just
Go ahead.
finish,
Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
it's not just the fact that
Mhm.
that it's not that it's not an optimal way to live your life, but also you're not removed from it like you are with eating meat. So a more equivalent of that would be like hunting or something like that. I'm not saying hunting is equivalent to, by the way, having sex with animals. I think hunting is fine. But like that's in people's minds. It's like when you are the one that's actually doing it, you can't be removed
Fine.
from the process.
I'll change the analogy. How about eating a dead animal you found versus having sex with a dead animal?
Eating a dead animal that you found versus having sex with a dead animal. So I think that having sex with a dead animal causes like disgust factor. I think that would be one. I think number
Okay.
two, it would be that it's not optimal way to live your life versus eating. Well, I guess like if the animal's been dead for a while, it's not optimal either because you're going to get
It's
sick.
fresh. It just
Okay,
you see
fresh. Okay,
it
just
just
die. Yeah,
keeled over. Yeah.
just died like 5 minutes ago. In which case, yeah, it's a optimal way to live your life if you believe in the paleo diet, which is what I do, right? Versus there's no like logic for why it's optimal to have sex with animals.
Well, not optimal. Like you talk about people have fetishes, for example. This just might be a fetish that some people have. Uh, Also, though, well, there was another point. Oh, then I know the point I wanted to make.
Go ahead.
It seems like the only argument you can make is, well, the reason it's because here's my argument I would make.
Go
Uh,
ahead.
it's wrong to have sex with animals because we can look at the human body and human nature and we can see what sex is for. We can see sex is a special thing for human beings. The parts literally line up together. And then a whole bunch of other sexual ethics would flow from that. Like, for example, it is wrong to have sex, pedophilia is wrong, along with the harms that it causes to children. But even if some wacko scientist said, actually, it doesn't really harm kids, I'd say, F you, buddy. These these human beings have not reached puberty yet. And so they can't possibly be ordered towards sex. But even if you have a teenager who's at puberty, there are also social reasons and legal reasons to say why this is wrong. But we can look at the human body. We can say, okay, what are we naturally ordered towards? It's clearly disordered. Our bodies are not made to have sex with animals. And we look at that kind of natural law perspective. And other moral issues will flow from that. But on your end, if it's just, well, it's okay to eat an animal that just died because, hey, it says nutrients, this or that, but it's not okay to have sex with an animal that just died because it just really disgusts me to see that. So it's not okay to do that. Well, by that logic, couldn't I say it's not okay for two men to have sex because the thought of that disgusts me?
You could absolutely try to make that argument.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people who do make that argument, but I think it's also tied into our evolution to some extent. I think that we just didn't evolve to to breed with other species, so we all have this, or at least like 99.9% of people have this primal disgust at the idea of having sex with an animal. Like we just find it like repulsive. We find it gross. We find it just it offends us on like so many different levels, right? I think that just, I mean, I don't know if you, I don't know, I'm sure you don't believe in evolution, but from people coming from,
I do believe in evolution.
okay, my bad for assuming, but the point is that like, yeah, like you just from an evolution argument, we're just like, we're just evolved to find it like really, really repulsive because if you're someone whose gene line was all about having sex with animals, then you probably didn't procreate and your gene line didn't survive.
Yeah, but we also evolved to find crippled or disfigured human beings to be repulsive and to avoid them. Like we did evolve that because our caveman ancestors, if someone was crippled or disfigured from an infectious disease, if they avoided that person, they didn't get sick and they passed on their genes. But it wouldn't follow, therefore, that it's moral for us to shun disfigured or sickly people because we evolved a desire to avoid those people. We have evolved a lot of desires as animals just to contribute to our species. But you would agree, right? It doesn't mean we should act on all the desires that we evolved to because animals do all kinds of things that humans would not be allowed to do. Like animals forcibly copulate to pass on their species. But when humans do that, that's the moral crime of rape and legal crime.
Yeah, well, I think the reason that animals don't get locked up for rape, and I do agree with you that it occurs a lot in the animal kingdom, is because we don't hold them to the same standards as us, because they don't really have nearly the same level of consciousness as we do.
Mhm.
But
We have
yeah,
reason. We have reason.
but I do agree with you that you are not obligated to act on every single one of your impulses, right? Like for example, a common one might be like you're at a bar and someone says something bad to you, right? I think most people would say like you're not justified in like punching them in the face and beating the shit out of them, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, I agree with you. We don't have to act on our impulses, but that doesn't change the
Mhm.
impulse, and that's that. For most people, if you're out and about and someone insults you or someone insults your, your wife, right? We do have this feeling of like anger, right? I think a lot of people, unless they're like really zen. But again, doesn't mean we have to act on that.
Well, okay,
But those two
let me
things are separated.
but I want to finish up because I also had the issue about consent in animals, which goes back because I'm trying to like when I try to figure out, I know it's a gross topic, but frankly, when there's so many sexual fetishes out there that people don't care, they're like, oh,
I just
whatever.
don't think we can equate like human to human sexual fetishes where there's no like parts being cut off to like having sex with animals. Like
I'm
I
not
just
well, or human to object, like having sex with, and you have sex with a sex doll. I would say that's disordered.
but I don't like would you compare that to the level of wrong to having sex with an animal?
Would I compare the wrong? I would say it's worse. Well, I would say it's worse to have sex to it with an animal because you're also harming the animal's dignity as well. You're misusing it. But when it
What if
comes to
the
well, let me finish.
animals go
Hold
ahead.
on, let me finish with the animal
Go
things.
ahead, go ahead.
Because once again, I'm trying to argue from a natural law perspective of what sex is for, based written within our human nature. If we're only using things like disgust, or if we're using, so I don't think disgust works. And I would say also the argument from consent, saying like, well, animals can't consent to sex, children can't consent to sex. That's why it's wrong to have sex with them. And I agree that consent is a necessary condition for sex, but that doesn't explain the wrongness. And I also don't think that argument, oh well, they can't consent, I don't know if that really holds up. So this is an argument that I gave when I was on the Whatever podcast recently, when I was talking to Jasmine about this, saying, look, like children cannot consent to work for the police, right? They can't go and become junior detective or something like that.
Yep.
Uh, but an animal, like, can a dog consent to being a canine officer with all of the risks that are involved? We as a society have said yeah, they can consent to, they could get shot on duty. Like they can consent to being an officer of the law. We don't consider it animal cruelty to have a canine work for the police. And yet, if you have a canine lick peanut butter off somebody's genitals, that's considered bestiality in a form of animal cruelty, even though it's way safer to do that than to tend to work for the police. So I think that it's not the consent issue that's driving it. It's the human nature issue that animals are meant to serve us either as food or as companions or protection. And so it's not disordered to use them for their intended purpose. And sex is for a very particular purpose. And it's gravely wrong to misuse it, like to have sex in a non human context or with an inanimate object, or to commit adultery, or to have rampant promiscuity and things like that. That's the point I was making.
Yeah. So to kind of explore what you're saying, what if the animal actually wants to fuck? Let's say it gives you all the signs of like, hey, I want to fuck you. Would you
Hey,
then
there's
say,
dogs that hump people's legs all the time.
yeah, yeah, well, exactly. So would you
Yeah.
then say it's as wrong as like having sex with a sex doll? Let's say we take that out of the picture.
Yeah, well, yeah, I would probably say that it's as wrong. I don't know. At least with the sex doll, you're trying to have a you're at least with the sex doll, you understand sex is for humans, and provided that it's a humanoid sex doll. Like, I don't know, if it's like a furry or some kind of animal sex doll, then it ends up being a wash, basically. I don't know. Um, but when sex is misused, there is the different types of the harm would be just the wrongness of the act itself, the harm it does to the person having sex, and the harm to the recipient. So with an inanimate object, it can't be harmed. So when you have an animal, and animals should be treated well. As a Christian, I think that animals, we can eat them, but we shouldn't abuse animals, shouldn't torture them. We're stewards of creation. So I would say that both uh sex, it's not sex, I can't even call it sex, masturbation with inanimate objects and masturbation with animals are both disordered, but animals, it may cause more harm because you're detracting from the dignity of another living creature. But they're both disordered in that sex is for human beings based on our human nature, which is something that cannot be explained. If sex is just recreational, all you can fall back on is, oh, well, it disgusts me. Well, then by that logic, anything that's disgusting, like homosexuality, open marriage, whatever it may be, you have no really ability to say whose disgust is rational and whose disgust is irrational. You have no basis to say that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's different levels to disgust. Like I would be much more disgusted about someone having sex with an 8-year-old than I would be someone having sex with like a 17-year-old, right? But also, I think it's important to acknowledge that we hold animals to a totally different standard than humans. If you were to replace cows with Jews or Asians, it would be considered genocide by pretty much every person. Versus that's
Yeah,
not the
right.
case here. And also, just
Yeah, of
to
course.
really quickly give a more practical reason, there's also a health issue that comes with having sex with animals. I can't believe I actually looked that up, but yeah, like you're much more likely to get some kind of a transmitted disease because of the interspecies nature of it. It's just much more likely to result
Is
in a
is there is
negative
there a health
consequence.
is there a health issue when you have premarital sex, especially with lots of partners?
But we're talking about a higher risk of something really fucking. Again, I've never fully deep dived into researching the health effects of having sex with the animals, so I will admit I have a fairly uh
It's probably a good thing.
superfluous view on this, but yeah,
That's probably good.
that seems to be what I'm reading. But taking having sex with animals aside, uh I think the other example I wanted to give was we're talking about sexual compatibility. I think that was the original thing.
Compatibility,
And
right.
yeah, and that, like, for example, I don't know how well did you follow the Hunter Avalon divorce story.
I've heard about it, but I haven't, I don't know a lot about it.
Yeah, like for example, one of the reasons that his wife gives for divorcing him was that they were just totally different sexually. He was like, I'm not going to get, well, anyway, they were just totally different. We'll leave it at that. We don't need to deep dive into Hunter's sexual failings.
Was it fetishes or was it just some other kind of
It,
behavior?
it wasn't, it was really actually a lot of it was a complete mismatch in sex drive. And
Okay,
also,
libido. Yeah, that
yeah,
happens. Mhm.
yeah. But if it's like, the wife wants to have sex twice a day and the guy only wants to have sex once every 2 weeks, you got an issue.
Yeah, but that's anything in marriage when there's, husbands and wives want to spend time together and you're in marriage and it's like, "Hey, actually, I only want to have deep conversations once every 2 weeks." And the wife says, "I want to have deep conversations twice a day." Every anything in marriage when you have so it's not just a sexual issue. There's other issues of compatibility that are going to arise that
Agreed.
you work through. But also, I would say that the more like if you're dating a lot of people, having premarital sex with lots of different people in order to discover compatibility. This isn't like just what's your favorite book or what's your favorite activity. Sex is such a powerful thing that bonds you and another person that when you then try to have sex with your spouse, you run the risk of the ghosts of your sexual past haunting you, remembering those encounters, longing for something in that encounter versus what you have now, because it leaves a more powerful imprint on the person, which is not really a great thing to bring into your marriage when you want to just fully give yourself to one other person.
Yeah, even if I was to grant all that, I would just say the logical solution is to just have premarital sex with a girl you're serious about. If it doesn't work out, then you can move on to the next girl. I think that's probably where most people stand. They're like, I don't think most guys or even most women are like, seriously dating and having sex with 3 or 4 different people. I think they're primarily having premarital sex with their boyfriend or their girlfriend or something like that. Uh,
Right.
but yeah, but no, I do think that having what you said was true is that like, well, there's other kinds of incompatibility. Yes, but those are easier to find out through talking about it versus sex ones are a little bit more difficult to find out, especially if the both people are virgins, what they actually like. But yeah, like
But let me
if you have
ask
a
you this.
situation,
Go ahead.
wait, sorry, if I could just finish. If you
Go
have a
ahead.
situation where, for example, the husband likes to work 80 hours a week and is really career focused, and the
Mhm.
wife just wants to travel and have fun, that's probably not going to work out either. So you can have incompatibilities in many different dimensions of your life, but the sex
Yeah, yeah.
one is one that's kind of unique in terms of like you sort of have to do it to truly figure it out, especially if you're both
Mhm.
virgins.
Well, what I would say though is that I understand that there's some elements of sex you're not going to figure out with each other until you get into the mechanics and you engage in the sexual act. But 2 points on here. One, preferences can change. I mean, if your goal is to get married, and actually, I don't know how much longer you wanna go, but I did have one last question for you in case we're
Yeah, go ahead.
wrapping it a bit. Uh, when the final goals, preferences are going to change over time. Like your sexual preferences when you're in your 20s may be very different than when in your 40s or in your 60s or your 80s. And so compatibility, and that's the same with all your different preferences. Your compatibilities are going to change, and you're going to, uh, guide through this process and grow together with another person. So when it comes to that, when it comes to discovering these compatibilities, also I would say that it's not just sex. Like I remember when my wife and I got married, we discovered after we got married, like we had been dating and hanging out together, but we didn't realize we had an incompatibility when it came to meal times. So we went on our honeymoon, and I liked eating my meals at 3 o'clock, 3 p.m., 7 p.m., and 10 p.m. And she liked eating her meals at 7 a.m., 11 a.m., and like 3 p.m. So like by the time I'd have my first meal of the day planned for us, she was like starving and wanted to die. So, but we can't be eating at 6 different times a day in a marriage. So we end up compromising on like, oh, what are the meal times? And I've changed in the preferences of what I want for that. And that's something that we honestly didn't notice, did not figure out or see. You go on dates, things like that, but you don't, on a honeymoon, we didn't go on, vacations together, things like that. Well, we did go on vacations with other people because we did went on a trip with a bunch of other people. But that's just one example. There's lots of examples of, hey, you might realize, oh, we're not aligned on this thing. Well, that's where you learn and grow in marriage and adapt. And I think the same thing happens with sex. And especially if you're trying to figure out the mechanics of it, that's a beautiful thing in marriage that you have promised to be with this person till death do you part. So there is a freedom to just give yourself to the other person without shame, without embarrassment. Just here I am, and however it goes, there's humor in that, and you get to grow through that. I do want to say before I go back to you, I agree with you that when it comes to compatibility, like there's a great book written by Pope Saint John Paul II before he was Pope, he wrote a book called Love and Responsibility. Before he was called, his name was Kara Watiwa. This was before he was Pope, and he interviewed married couples. He would do, counseling sessions for them. He'd take them on camping trips, and he talks about the role and nature of sex, and he talks about the importance of sexual compatibility. Even within that book, he talks about the importance of trying to attain mutual orgasm together to make sure that both of you experience that pleasure even at the same time if it's possible. So I agree with you on that the compatibility is important. I would just be concerned about that premarital sex is not really a feasible way to discover that, and there's just more harms associated with it.
Just to quickly respond to that, I would say there's the example you brought up about different meal times. There's minor preferences and there's significant preferences in needs. I like to stay up
You
late.
haven't seen my wife when she's hangry.
I have not. I've never met your wife. That's true.
She got better at that though, and we grew in marriage in that regard. And I grew.
Sure. And in some ways you can grow, but I like to stay up late. My girlfriend likes to wake up relatively early. We make it work. We compromise. We meet somewhere in the middle. But on some things, like if we're too different, you sometimes don't have a middle ground. And fortunately for us, we're both into similar shit sexually, right? We're both have similar level of libido. We both are into mildly kinky shit, but nothing super crazy. So we have enough overall. There's so on that important issue, we're pretty close together.
But here's, go ahead, and then I had a thought on that.
No, well, that's basically the point on that.
But what I would say that when we're, and this will go to my more roundup question for you, what I'm trying to figure out when it comes to marriage. I'll end with that. But not end. We can talk about it and and just see everything. I think that if your goal is marriage, I think compatibility is important, but it's not a non-negotiable. I mean, arranged marriages, even in the United States, have like a 4% divorce rate. It's not because if you get divorced in arranged marriage, they're going to burn you alive or something. It's more because the attitude going into the marriage is of even if we don't, and arranged marriage is not married blind, they do know the other person, but they go into it seeing that the goal of our union is to make a stable, long-lasting marriage for us and for our children, and we're committed to that goal. And so you develop compatibility, you learn to live with one another, even if you have some discompatibilities. But having that foundation is important, because if the foundation of your marriage is on other kinds of physical compatibilities, then you're in real trouble. What if your spouse gets sick or disabled and can't have sex anymore? And that was something that was a major point for you. You may be severely handicapped in having the discipline to love your spouse, even though you don't have this important thing to bond you together, rather than the most important thing, which is having the same vision of what marriage is for, of being this expression of marital love, permanent, monogamous, the full gift of self to the other person till death do us part. So that's where I would be concerned that if we're just banking on, if I make sure, and it's not just sex, it's also friendships, interests, things like that. If I make sure it's all compatible, and then I'm going to be good in marriage. Things change in marriage, sometimes slightly, sometimes catastrophically. I would say, and as a religious person, that's why I believe in having the grace of God and having a spiritual life as that foundation is the most important. But I would say that if you bank it on those things, there is a real danger you haven't developed a core foundation in case through circumstance you may not have that anymore, or preferences change or things like that. And then you can reply. And then my last thing was just do you want to get married? And do you have kind of an end goal with your life? But you can reply and go to that whenever you want.
Sure. I'll just quickly reply to what you said, and I'll go to that. But the real question, I think, is in terms of arranged marriages, are people who have arranged marriages more happy than people who freely choose their partner? I would argue that probably not. But the reason they have a lower divorce rate is because there's much more social pressure for them to stay together. Yes, I know you're not going to get shot in the head, at least not in America, if you get a divorce in an arranged marriage. But there's social pressure. There's community pressure. So I would argue that those people are definitely, because they're the kind of person that was led into an arranged marriage, right? Because it means typically they're in a much more tight-knit community. Their parents play.
Well, you're making an assumption they're not happier. You haven't given data on that.
Yeah, well, that's why I said I posed it as a question. I said that I would argue probably not, but I can't prove that. We can, if you want to really get into that, we can look it up. But yeah. So in terms of asking me, do I want to get married? If I was to ever have a kid, I probably would get married. At this point in my life, I don't see any benefit to me getting married to my girlfriend. I just don't see any point of involving the government in our relationship. I feel like our relationship can be just as close without that piece of paper. And yeah, it just seems to me, it's like it's something that can hurt me potentially, but I don't see how it can help me.
Well, do you ever see yourself breaking up with your girlfriend?
I don't see it, but it's a possibility.
Like, would you want to be with her for the rest of your life?
Yeah, if all things go well, then yeah, that would be nice.
What do you mean if all things go well?
Meaning that if we don't, have any like significant issues, if she doesn't betray me, if whatever, if she doesn't change to become a totally different person, then yeah, that would be nice. I would like to. I think she feels the same way, but we're not. I don't think I'm naive enough to say like we're gonna be together forever. It's like no, we don't fucking know what's gonna happen
So
5, 10 years
so
from now.
you guys so you two have a conditional love in your relationship where you'll love and be with her provided she meets certain conditions.
All love outside of like parents and children is conditional. Like you will love your wife a lot less if she cheats on you, whether or you might not love her at all. So all love is
No,
conditional.
no, I will always love my wife, and even if she cheats on me, I'm going to be angry. But love means to will the good. So here, if she commits adultery, then I would encourage her to confess that, to own up to it, to seek therapy and counseling to change her behavior so that doesn't happen again, and urge her to do acts that would repair the damage that's done to our marriage because I love her and I want her to be free of this bad thing this bad thing that she's done. But the essence of marriage, though, what makes it such a beautiful thing, and why one reason I would say married people are happier, is that you have chosen to make this promise. It's not some kind of calculated business decision, but rather saying, I love you so much. I love you. I will take you as you are, no matter what happens. Even if you end up in a permanent vegetative state, I will make sure that you are cared for because I love you. And if you can find somebody who has that feeling for you, then wouldn't you want to marry him?
But let's say your wife. Okay, so what I think, I have a different view on marriage than you do. But let's say your wife cheats on you like a dozen times, right? Would you still love her equally to the way you do now?
I would love her, but I would have a severe amount of anger and probably some resentment. And if it's serial adultery that she refuses, and I would say the same if I did that and she had
Yeah,
this towards
yeah,
me.
yeah.
Like if you love your spouse, so for example, if you love your spouse and they become a drug addict or a serial adulterer, or they're doing something to harm your family, especially if you have children, then the loving thing to do might be to say, you have to go get help. You can't live here anymore until you resolve this. You might have to be legally separated. And in some rare cases, to protect your children, you might have to legally divorce. But even here, you've chosen to make that promise to care for them, even if they've done this ultimate thing to hurt you. Because once you start putting conditions on marriage, you say, well, I'll stay, I promise to be true to you until it gets tough. Like, and once you get dementia or Alzheimer's and you're a different person, I'm going to bail. That's not love. That's transaction. But real love, people really hunger for it. And I would say premarital sex does not prepare you to offer real love with that kind of a sacrifice. And that's what I offer you. And it's real. I know people who've been married for 50 years. They died close apart in their 80s. It is something that people can have. It's not a pipe dream, but it's something you have to work for.
Yeah, dementia is different though than betrayal because dementia, like they didn't do it consciously, right? It was something that was basically it's a condition, it's a medical condition. That's different. Betrayal is different than getting hit by a car or something like that. Versus serial at the very I would say one act of cheating is one too many, but serial cheating and sleeping around when that's not your relationship, you're in a monogamous relationship, I assume. So that would be totally different. That would hit totally different because that's betrayal. So people tend to be a little bit more sensitive about being betrayed than they do about someone
There is a
suffering.
moral.
Suffering. Wait,
Yeah, I mean,
if I could
go
just
ahead. Go
finish.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
The other point I was
I
going.
apologize for interrupting.
No, it's all good. It's all good, man. So I think I think the majority of people would say that, like, yeah, if my wife cheated on me even multiple times, I would either love her less or I would not love her at all. Certainly for me, I would definitely not love my girlfriend if she betrayed me in that significant of a fashion. It just wouldn't. I mean, maybe there would be some leftover love, but it would be significantly diminished. In terms of, again, unconditional love, it sounds nice. And I do agree with you that there's couples that stay married for 40, 50 years. But typically in those situations, one of the partners doesn't like betray the other person. They don't cheat on them. They don't like really fuck them over or anything like that. But I think that just to expect a conditional life, unconditional love from your partner is kind of a fairy tale. I think, again, the only people that where there can be unconditional love would be parents and children. And even then, it's up for debate because, like, what if you find out that your dad is a serial killer? Would you love them the same? Well, I don't know. Me personally, maybe not. Probably not, honestly. So I don't.
Mm.
So unconditional love is probably the closer you get to it is with children and parents. But when it comes to like partners, no, it's always conditional. The question is, what are those conditions? Now, if the conditions are like you have to fuck me twice a week and you have to stay super healthy, then we would argue that's a very superficial condition. But if it's like, hey, don't fuck me over, don't cheat on me, don't betray me, then we would argue, okay, that's a reasonable condition.
Is it reasonable to say you can't gain a lot of weight?
Um, Less reasonable than the cheating, more reasonable than dementia.
More reasonable than dementia. So it makes more sense to leave someone because they gained weight than if they had dementia.
No, it's that
Well, I didn't
it's
understand you mean by more reasonable.
so it's I mean in terms of like the level of, I guess, I don't know, the level of, let me just phrase it like this. When someone gets dementia, that's not through a conscious decision. They didn't do anything to earn that, right? Versus someone gains weight, the vast majority of the time, it's because they choose to, gain weight, right? That's the vast majority of the time. That's how it works. So, yeah, I mean, I think in theory, it'd be nice if you could love your partner the same, even if they gain like 100 pounds. I don't think most people would. If you now no longer find your partner like even attractive enough to have sex with, I think most reasonable people in that situation who are married would probably try to work it out first. They'd be like, hey, it's getting kind of ridiculous. Can you go to the gym and lose weight? And you would probably try to work on it a bit. Maybe you would even try therapy. But if the other person completely refused to listen and say, I'm going to eat cheeseburgers, fuck you, then like at some point you'd be like, okay, this is not going to work out for me because I'm no longer attracted to you.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that the condition for love is that the other person doesn't uh, commit an unloving act, so that they don't do something bad or betraying or hurtful. And so that's the condition there. Versus, would you say, versus saying, okay, I'm gonna be with you even if you get sick, even if you something really bad happens to you, even if you start losing your mind. But I guess it's interesting you've put this kind of um, special box around just specific wrong acts versus just really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I do think for most people they would be separate, including for myself. But honestly, I think it's easier to say that you would love your wife the same. But I think that I mean, unless you're like a rare exception to the rule, if your wife was to cheat on you like a dozen times, you would lose a lot of love for her. Like, I just,
Or
unless,
you would say it's much harder to love her. Just like
well,
it's hard to love our enemies, for example. But as a
well,
Christian,
you already love her though, so it's not like you need to gain more love, right? You're already in love with your wife, I'm assuming.
well, no, love, I would say, is a decision of the will. It's not a feeling. Love is when you choose to will the good for another person to provide. And so we love lots of people in different ways. You love the homeless by giving them money, for example, but you love your spouse. You will very particular goods for them in virtue of sharing a life together, sexual bonding, family headship, and things like that. So you are still obliged to your spouse to provide goods for them to love them, but just as it's hard to love our enemies, to pray for them, to will their good for them, that they'll repent of their evil, if your spouse has become your enemy by abandoning you or committing adultery, this is as part of the Christian ethic. You're called to love your enemy. It's very, very difficult, but there's a unique element here because you made a particular promise to care for them, much the same way that as a Christian, I would love my spouse even if they sin against me. And that doesn't mean I'm going to let them walk all over me. If they're going to be serial adulterers, they might have to get out of the house until they figure this out, or might have to be legally separated. God treats me the same way, that God loves me, but he's always calling me away from doing evil and calling me towards him to do good, to spend eternal life with him. So but when you said it's a fairy tale, I would just push back on that hard, because fairy tales do not exist, but there are people who have been married, who have endured tremendous hardship, who have not committed adultery. It is not unheard of things. They are, and they're not just like one in a million either. There's a significant number of individuals like this. And so it's something real that can be achieved, but one has to be willing to make that sacrifice. And that sacrifice really involves making those vows, knowing that you don't know the future, but you're going to love that other person regardless of what the future holds.
Yeah, I think that we might be looking at love a bit differently, maybe not significantly, but definitely a bit differently. I would describe it as a feeling. There's also different types of love. There's like the love you have for a child, the love you have for your dog, and then there's romantic love, which is the life you have for your life. So the way, I don't know if you have kids, but if you do, the way you love
I
your
have three
kids,
kids.
yeah,
Three
the way you
boys.
love your kids is quite different than the way you love your wife, I'm assuming.
That's right.
So there's different types of love. And when I say a fairy tale, I mean the concept of unconditional love, right? So the threshold for what is the breaking point might differ based on the couple. For some people, the threshold for a breaking point might be really, really high. They'll put up with a lot, but eventually there's something that can be done. They'll push them over the edge where they will no longer like, love, and respect that person. Or at least for the vast, vast majority of people. But again, for every rule, there's an exception. I'm just looking as a general rule. And I think, again, if we look at most couples, if the guy or the girl was to serially cheat on them, they would lose love for that person, if not completely all love. But yeah, I don't know if you want to keep going on this, or
I don't know. My wife's probably wonder when I'm going to head back here in a bit. So
no, it's all good, man. Yeah, I think we've gone for
we've gone
2.5 hours.
for a while. So this is a nice element to end on, I think. So
Yeah, for sure, man. No, I enjoyed the discussion. I thought it was a good faith debate / discussion. And yeah, I should actually, I'll definitely invite you on panels I do in the future, because you and I agree on some things, but there's actually people I have on my channel that you're going to disagree on everything with. And those makes for spicier debates. So I'll definitely let you know next time I'm doing one.
Yeah, that might be interesting. So sounds good.
Yeah, for sure. All right, buddy. Thanks for coming on. Tell people where they can find you.
Yes, they can find me. Just search Council of Trent, COUNSEL. That's over on YouTube and podcasts. And you can also check out my work at Catholic.com. And I have my own website, TrentHorn.com.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. It was a fun discussion. We covered a lot of topics. Trent was a good faith debater. He engaged with me on all the points. And for that, I respect him. All right, guys. Appreciate you all. Have a good night. Take it easy.